Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the Asianism Retold, Asian Values and Global Leadership Virtual Roundtable series. I understand that in today's session we have participants and attendees from representing over 20 countries from around the world. Wherever you are in the world, we hope that you are keeping safe during these uncertain times, and we really want to thank you for joining us. Asianism Retold is a program to understand the values that shape Asia's influence in geopolitics and development. We have a great lineup of speakers today, and we are really looking forward to having you join the discussion. I would like to briefly introduce the co-leads of this program, Neha, Bansal, and also Litcy, Kurisnkal. Neha is a One Asia Fellow at Harvard University, and Litcy Kurisnkal is another friend from Harvard who is a Human Rights Policy Paper Prize awardee 2013 from the Harvard Kennedy School. Myself, I am the Vice President at the Center for Asia Leadership, an organization that engages in research and training, helping business and policy leaders initiate change and manage progress in their organizations and communities across Asia, also represented by our president, Samuel Kim. I'd also like to introduce Dr. Pramod Jaiswal, the Research Director at the Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement, a nonpartisan think tank undertaking research and activities on issues of international relations, foreign policy, security, and development. So just also to very briefly, we're going to have a more detailed bio of them later, but to very briefly introduce our speakers, Dr. Parag Khanna is the author of The Future is Asian, Global Order in the 21st Century. Dr. Rebecca Chungee Kim, joining us actually from Japan. She is a professor of Ritsumeikan, Asia Pacific University in Japan. Ambassador Belahari Kausikan, who is joining us, of course, from Singapore, is the former permanent secretary of the Singapore Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Geeta Chandran is a Padma Shree awardee, a national awardee, and she's also an Indian classical dancer and artist. Also joining us from India as well is Dr. Amitav Mukherjee, who is a former advisor, government of India, and also a former senior expert also at UNESCAP in Thailand. Finally, it's Dr. Soyoung Kim, who is the director of the Korea Policy Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution in KAIST in Korea. And for today's agenda, we will begin with the co-lead of this program, Neha Bansal, who will share a background, the concept for this whole initiative, for this whole program. And it's called Asian Values and Asian Leadership. After that, I will transfer the facilitation duties to my co-lead, Litcy Kurisnkal, and she will introduce and facilitate the discussion, first with Dr. Parag Khanna, who is presenting on The Future is Asian. Next, Dr. Rebecca Chungee Kim on value-oriented inclusive leadership of Asia. After Dr. Kim is Ambassador Belahari Kausikan, who will share on the geopolitics of human rights in Asia. I'm sure we can hear from his experiences in foreign policy as well. After Ambassador Kausikan is Geeta Chandran, who's going to talk about dance as a way of life. Next is Dr. Amitav Mukherjee, who will respond to this question: are there Asian values? And finally, not last but not least, is Dr. Soyoung Kim, who will talk about Asian values and cross-national responses to the global pandemic. In the last 30 to 40 minutes, Litcy is going to have an open discussion on questions that are submitted and also questions that we also have to the speakers. And finally, we will close with a closing talk with my friend Dr. Jaiswal from NIICE from Nepal. Just some friendly reminders before we start. Please do participate in the Q&A and the chat. So there's on the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A box. If you have any questions, even before the open discussion time, please do submit your question in the Q&A box. If you have any thoughts or observations, insights you want to share, please do share it in the chat box. You can also gain access to this recording. We will be sharing these to all registrants, at least within 24 hours once this ends. Also, we want to share if there happens to be any tech slips. We're living in a very uncertain age, but we hope it doesn't happen. But if it does, we do apologize in advance. And finally, of course, learn and enjoy. So I would like to introduce the co-lead of Asianism Retold. Neha Bansal is a One Asia Fellow at the Ash Center. She is also the India country lead for the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery. She is also a social policy expert for South Asia at the UN Office on Drugs and Crime and also at the UN Development Program. And she is also a former civil servant at the UK Government Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office. So without further ado, Neha Bansal, Asian Values and Asian Leadership. Let's hear what you have to say. The floor is yours.
Thank you, John. The world is looking towards Asia today, and Asians find themselves increasingly at the center of global influence and voice. So this initiative on Asianism Retold, started with my colleagues from Harvard, is one to really understand what is the nature of this voice. And it's based on the hypothesis that the impressive economic growth that the region has shown, the fact that it's been able to flex its muscles diplomatically and militarily, the number of people, Asians, who are populating global institutions has only brought the region to the table. But what is more important to understand and what is really going to sustain the influence of the Asian region is when it can provide a differentiating voice to what's happening in the world. And that differentiating voice is going to come when it can actually legitimize and actualize an identity and a value system that is its own. So it's with that we've actually started this series of roundtables, because this is a very, very wide topic. And I've just thrown open a wide towel on a topic that needs a lot of discussion. And through these series of roundtables, we want to really sharpen our focus, hear from you, be counter debated by you, so that we're able to really understand what is it that we must focus on in this broad canvas. Now, just to start the discussion, I'm going to talk about Asian values and development, the whole concept of the topic of diversity and Asian values, and the last bit talking about the opportunity that we might have at hand. Like I said, it's a broad towel, but I will try and touch upon a few things. Now, what are Asian values? Asian values, or values in terms of what you hold, give importance to, orientations in terms of your lifestyle, ideology, action. And some of the aspects that come up in the Asian region are aspects like family, community, something that we very interestingly call Jugaad in South Asia, which is the ability to innovate, to find solutions as you go along with very few resources. Then you have aspects like collectivism, where you're looking at the benefit of the whole rather than the individual. Spirituality, religion, what's happening within rather than what's happening outside. So, and of course, these can be debated on whether they are Asian values, but these are some of the areas that you see, in terms of what people put value on in this region. And these values have also sort of underpinned our economic growth in the region. Now, whether you look at the Han's miracle or Miracle on the Han's River, South Korea's quick development from being a developing economy to a developed economy right after its 3-year war with North Korea, with very little industrial growth, or Japan's economic growth moving it to the second largest economy in the world after World War II, right after Cold War. Several would say that it underpins a value of community, the kind of importance that they gave to community, or the fact that, in the words of Chongyang, their prime minister, which is taking the short-term discomfort for the long-term gain. And then you have aspects like family, which, in India, for example, you have the largest industry that is run by a family body, Reliance. So also in Malaysia, Hong Kong, the Sunmai in Hong Kong, and so on. And these sort of family systems being, natural what do I call them, social protection schemes or policies, whether it is buffering and unemployment within of the family, childcare, training, apprenticeship on the family, in the family itself. So these are some of these, values that have underpinned our economic growth. But we tend more to focus on the impressive growth of the region rather than talking about these values, or we don't talk about them enough. There have, of course, been, economists like Elinor Ostrom, a Nobel-winning economists, who started talking about the whole value of community systems and that being an economic value, or similar aspect, or even the Keiretsu, from Japan, that was a business sort of unit that's now being used by companies, automobile companies like Toyota and things like that. So you have a certain re-emergence, but it isn't enough, and I think we should be talking about that much more. However, the more important point, and I think the reason why we really started this project is, to me, it seems that not talking about these values that underpin the way we do business, the way we are in Asia, has certain negative ramifications. We are reaching a certain sameness in how we view development. We seem to take on ideals and approaches that may not reflect who we really are. And two aspects that I want to bring to the front. One is, despite the number of trade relations that we have within the region, despite the fact that we are a rapidly growing economy, we have organizations like the ADB putting money, pumping in money into integration of the region. The trust deficit of the region is a seeping hole. And this has been called out by the World Bank as well. This is despite trade relations. And you can see that in terms of real perceived tariffs that we put in terms of our, when we trade with each other, when we look at para-tariffs. And according to the report, it's far more expensive for a South Asian country to actually trade with each other. The World Bank report puts it at 20 times, rather than trading with a country as far as Brazil. But where we bought in certain values, for example, informal relations, even on the India-Bangladesh border, that has been able to, of course, improve people's life, incomes and livelihoods, but has really moved us in terms of integration of the region. In fact, from my lens, coming in from the lens of anti-human trafficking and modern slavery, these informal systems have even sort of been able to bring down human smuggling across these borders. So the point that I'm trying to make really is that we've got to look at what are these values that underpin us, because that is what is really going to help, and it isn't about localizing, it isn't about contextualizing our development programs. It's really about our development programs reflecting, the value system of this region. The other example I want to give is of development. Amartya Sen, Mahbub ul Haq, several economists have talked about development being that which offers choices, freedom, and the means to development, that is education, health, livelihood, being, like I said, just means. But again, we've sort of overemphasized the means and not the end, which is freedom. And one area that we've done that is in education. So today we have far more people getting into education. In fact, South Asia has almost a 90% secondary enrollment. China has moved its GR from 5% to 15% in just 9 years, whereas countries like the US, even Japan, took about 25 years, 30 years to do that. So very fast enrollment of people in education. But to me, it seems that we have reached or are reaching a point of a mindless reliance on structures, concepts, and that ability of jugaad to be able to creatively find solutions is being lost. And one way that Japan has found to do that is actually have people outside institutions, which was a very traditional way or education of the region, by having children join school much later than now. In fact, Google is starting to do that with having its people outside of institutions. So certain values that we held, which are actually coming back to us in different ways. And like I said, we're moving towards a certain sameness. So that's to begin with. The other two quick points I want to bring up is the whole question on diversity. The region has been called one of the most diverse regions of the world, and that is definitely something that we're going to encounter. Can you please go back to the previous slide? As we talk about the whole topic on values. But to me, it seems that we are looking at this whole question on value, on diversity, a little more superficially. We talk about diversity in food, in clothing, in language, in cultures, and we tend to stop at that. And perhaps like I said, we're looking at this question a little bit more superficially. The reason being that even when you look at values, the Asian values, you will have a basket of positive values and negative values. So aspects that I mentioned in terms of family, community, both that can be taken positively, negatively, or rather more negative values that have been put on the region, which is lack of transparency, lack of discipline, in terms of poverty, in terms of, the dirt, squalor, human rights violations and things like that. But that too has to be decoded with the fact that these are countries that are building perhaps their identity on a few years, on an era of humiliation. So if you look at India that came out, or India and several others that came out of colonial past, China that came out of, entire era of humiliation due to the two opium wars, conceding Hong Kong. And so you have a certain self-image that's being propagated to the world that is based on this, but also within the region that sort of may take on a certain moral hierarchy. For example, India putting out the image of non-violence, Mahatma Gandhi, and claiming a certain moral higher stand due to those values that it puts out. The second is also diversity in terms of who is asking this question. So you have, scholars who talked about nationalism being an important part in the whole idea on Pan-Asianism. You have Rabindranath Tagore who completely discarded that. You have Van Hue who talks about Asia as not being, we can't look at Asia without problematizing the whole topic on the whole identity of Europe. And then Okakura who talks about the aesthetic, religious, the Buddhist principles. So you have a diversity in who is asking this question as well. And then you have people who hold these values both within the region and outside these region. And finally, a differentiation in the manifestation of these values. One example being, the forms of governments that we have, authoritarian governments and democracies, and the whole range in between, illiberal democracies, liberal non-democracies, Hong Kong, etc. But the value system perhaps, or the underlying aspect being, something that we could say is similar in this case, being neo-authoritarianism, where the state must come in and decide on the welfare and is important, important actor in determining the progress of the community. We can move on to the next one. So I just wanted to lay that out on the table in terms of unpacking this whole question on diversity. And then finally, the reason, I think in terms of why we have an opportunity ahead. So Asia has gone through 2 rounds of economic growth. The first one with, Japan, the 4 tigers of Asia, Hong Kong, Singapore, and those countries. The second being the opening up of China and India and the reforms that we saw in these countries. And the third one, and importantly, the third phase of growth, which is Bangladesh, Vietnam, and Indonesia. So we have this window of opportunity to really ask ourselves the question, which is, what is the kind of development we want to ensure, is taken forward in the region? The second, and very interestingly, we have various foreign policy scholars on this call, which is, so far, foreign policy has been a very elitist area, with a few people deciding on behalf of the country, the foreign policies on behalf of the country, and being perhaps removed from what's happening with the national, in terms of national communities. But with the coming in of Twitter diplomacies, the CNN effect, and it's something that we see here in India, even during COVID, when Modi decided to put out his vaccines for the region, we had far more people, local people from my community who had an opinion on whether they thought it was right or wrong for us to give out vaccines to Bangladesh, Nepal, etc. So you have many more people coming into and thinking about foreign policy. You have an entire mushrooming of the IR, international relations courses, with many young scholars taking that up. And the original framing being of what is the world, what is happening in the world, and how must we be responding nationally. That changing to what is happening within our domestic countries, our national thinking, and how can we reflect that in the international regime. So we are seeing a shift in the ideology and the thinking, the teaching on IR, international relations in the region. So with that, I'm just going to leave the floor open, and we have various others whom we are very, very keen to hear from today, like I said. Just to give you a little background on where this really started, while I was at the Kennedy School at Harvard, I saw that I was really missing an opportunity to see a basket of models that I could choose from, basket or a choice of policy frameworks that reflect values of different regions. That didn't happen. And it's a conversation on that led, various professors from the Kennedy School to actually sit up and say that maybe it's time for us to have an Asia program that looks at some of these values. And it's with that, that we started this program. We hope to have a research component added to this, which I said is an important portion, but also, a series of these conversations so that many more people can engage with this idea and, formulate it. With that, I'm going to leave the floor. Thank you so much, and looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much, Neha, for setting the stage for this wonderful discussion. You have talked about Asian values from different dimensions. Is Asian value a myth or a reality? Is it a vague concept or something that really needs exploration? So that is a big question here. And we are so honored to have such an amazing range of speakers, experts here with us today. My name is Litcy Kurisnkal. I'll be moderating this session. I'm a human rights research consultant. When I started working with Neha on this project, I started thinking about what Asian values are in my personal life. And I remember growing up in India without being conscious about a regional identity. I often identified myself as an Indian, always connected myself to the nation than as a region. But growing up, when I went to the US and UK for my higher studies, and currently I live in the US, I always noticed that Asians, from whichever country they may be, tend to flock together. There was some invisible affinity that brought us together. Some values that we were not conscious about during our growing up years brought us together. So it's so personal in one sense, but also if you look at leadership, there are so many traditional values and so many values in different areas that are perceived as informal. So I think it's high time this is converted into a formal concept and explore the potential that we carry. But this is not for me to say here today. We are here to listen to the wonderful panel of experts. It was such a enlightening and evolutionary journey for us as we read many papers and books written by the very honorable speakers who are with us today. So without further ado, let's start the panel discussion. So our first speaker is a very young, dynamic global strategist, intellectual, and a best-selling author, Dr. Parag, a visionary who convinced the world that The Future is Asian, indeed, with his much sought after book. He's also the author of a trilogy of books on the future of world order. Parag is the founder and managing partner of Future Map, a data and scenario-based strategic advisory firm. Parag has been an advisor to the US National Intelligence Council's Global Trends 2030 program. From 2013 to 18, he was a senior research fellow in the Center on Asia and Globalization at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. During 2007, he served in Iraq and Afghanistan as a senior geopolitical advisor to United States Special Operations Forces. From 2002 to 2005, he was a Global Governance Fellow at the Brookings Institution. Dr. Khanna has been honored as a young global leader of the World Economic Forum. Dr. Khanna, we are very excited to have you with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Litcy. Thank you, Neha. Thank you, John. I'm delighted to be with you today. You've set the stage beautifully. Neha, thank you so much for that tour de force at the opening and explaining the rationale behind this initiative. I remember when I was presenting the Asia book at Harvard in 2019 with Tarun Khanna, Sugata Bose, we had such a in-depth conversation about what directions Harvard's engagement with Asia could take. And things were more nascent then, but you've given a real shape to what has been done, but more importantly, what can be done in the years ahead, so that scholars around the world, young students especially, start to appreciate Asia in a far more holistic and interdisciplinary kind of way. So kudos to all of you. I'll give a very brief presentation around this question of new Asian values, but again, in the historical context, in the economic and even geopolitical context, and I hope that that will help us to kick off the further conversation. So let me just share my slides and hope that they come up for you to see here. So the first image I wanted to share with you is a map that I produced. This was quite a painstaking exercise to look at the full geographical extent of major civilizations of Asian history. And what you see fundamentally, without reading through all of them, of course, but starting from bottom to top in chronological order, is of course the overlap of so many of them. And I simply wanted to begin with the point that Asia is a sponge, not a block. And very often people say, well, is Asia going to simply be led by China? And are we entering a bipolar US-China world? And so forth. I say, well, Asian geopolitics does not actually follow, neither past, present, or future, the kinds of prisms that dominate Western international relations theory. The majority of Asian history, the full extent of Asia that I've captured here, which again stretches all the way to the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea, Asia as a whole has never, with the exception of that color, one of those shades of pink that's represented by the Mongol Empire, has not really fallen under unipolar hegemony. And it's not likely to again. Instead, we should think of Asia much more as a sponge, as a multi-layered, textured sequence of, again, a multipolar assortment of civilizations that have a significant amount of mutual influence, all the way back to the ways in which the Buddhist religion spread or Chinese script spread, to today how economic development operates, by which, for example, you cannot really understand the rise of the modern Chinese economic superpower without appreciating the role that Japan played. And of course, territories such as Taiwan and Hong Kong that have either been autonomous or independent or under colonial control played in China's rise. But of course, today, again, most people look at China and they see a sui generis, inside-out story rather than appreciating the role, again, what I call a mutually reinforcing waves of growth played. Let me give you an example of what's happening right now in terms of the collective Asian story. And this is simply trade. This is not investment flows. This is not demographics, capital. It's just trade. Now, over the last 30 years, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, what has happened is that this fuller Asian expanse has been able to reconnect with itself. The various sub-regions or nations of Asia have expanded their trade relationships very, very significantly. The very first episode of that is what we call the commodities supercycle. It's when the Persian Gulf or Gulf West Asian energy resources began to flow more east across the Indian Ocean than west, given the rising consumption and demand. What you can see with these blue lines, every important vector of trade between Asia has increased in volume. I've actually gone back to the years 2005, 2010, 2015, and this is roughly the 2018 data. And the number associated with each pair of countries in terms of the trade volume has grown and grown and grown very steadily. So Asia is becoming a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. And that is a process that was not allowed or not possible during the colonial era and during the Cold War. So it's really been about 500 years that Asia, since the last iteration of the Silk Roads, if you will, that Asia has had this opportunity to reconnect. And it has taken this opportunity magnificently, because today, as we know, intra-Asian trade within Asia accounts for 60% of Asian trade. And that number, that quotient is rising steadily. And most recently, we had the ratification of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which will further deepen that intra-Asian trade. In just a 30-year period of time, we've had such a staggering rediscovery of Asian complementarities across this vast geographic space. And there's a lot more of that to come. Again, this is just trade. You can actually look in categories like commodities, you can look at electronics, you can look at, again, the flows of people, and there's, by almost any conceivable measure, you have that deepening. Now let's look at, again, what is underpinning this story and driving it further is that Asia represents 50% of global GDP today, also about more than 50% of the world population. Here I'm showing you GDP in purchasing power parity terms. Again, what's been happening and will continue to happen is that Asians buy and sell, Asians consume goods made in Asia by Asians and pay for them in Asian prices, right? And that's more or less an accurate description of what's happening. So why we continue to measure economies largely in US dollar terms when imports of oil priced in US dollars are a declining share of their GDP and where US dollar reserves are declining in their overall holdings remains a mystery. We have to make this transition towards appreciating Asia based upon its own internal dynamics. And again, here, as you can see, some of these countries in the middle, like Russia, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and so forth, that we have traditionally thought of as post-colonial appendages of the West or countries striving to join the West, such as Russia or Turkey, that's no longer true. These are countries that trade more, increasingly trade more with Asia or are participating in Asian institutions, and certainly from a normative standpoint, to get to the values question, identify more perhaps, or whether it's a matter of convenience or identity can vary, but certainly lean more east than west these days. Let's talk about the infrastructure and the geopolitics. This is a map that shows some of, but not all, of the various major infrastructure projects that are connecting Asian societies. Now, first and foremost, the category of activity that we're talking about right now is cross-border infrastructure and infrastructure finance. We're not talking about Belt and Road per se. Belt and Road is simply one manifestation of one country's contribution and leadership through bilateral relationships to this broader trend of greater cross-border infrastructure development. It's something that predates Belt and Road, and if Belt and Road never existed, it would still be happening. Europe has been making significant contributions over the decades through the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Japan through Japanese lending and investment, JBIC and others. The Asian Development Bank, which Neha also mentioned, and now, of course, also Belt and Road. It's all of these together that comprise and underwrite, bilaterally or multilaterally, this picture of Asia knitting itself together. Now, why is this a values issue? Well, let's remember that one of the reasons you have this phenomenon at all, one of the reasons that China has deployed Belt and Road and why Belt and Road has become so big is that the 4.5 billion people who live on this map, let's remember again, just to reiterate, inside this rectangle lives the majority of the human population. And that's always going to be true because the population of the rest of the world is actually declining or will begin to decline absent very significant inward migration, mostly of Asians, right? So humanity's future is Asia's future, right? And these countries, whether it is the post-colonial countries of South Asia, whose populations have tripled or quadrupled since independence in the 1940s, or whether it's the post-Soviet republics, what they all have had in common is a desperate need for modern infrastructure. And this is one of the critical areas of so-called global public goods that the West more or less neglected and abandoned by choice starting in the 1970s. So what constitutes a priority for the modernization and development for the majority of humankind was more or less neglected by global governance institutions for decades. So it required Asian solutions, and Asians have been coming up with those solutions. And whether it is the AIIB or Belt and Road or ADB and so forth, their contributions to make all of these railways and pipelines and electricity grids and internet cables real is a significant example of Asia's coming up with Asian solutions to Asian problems. Maybe they are building upon the institutional architecture that pre-exists in trade agreements, of course, the WTO, for example, but that's not to say that everything is being done in a Western way, right? Not at all. Things are now being done in Asian ways. Let me show you how that plays out institutionally, because you now have Asians moving from being rule takers to rule makers. Again, you can borrow the framework of historical trade agreements. Those are a platform in a way that all regions of the world use more or less. What I want to show you here is the increasing density of the regional diplomatic system of Asia. Again, especially in areas like trade, where now RCEP and others are a demonstration that Asians are moving forward with trade liberalization while other areas or regions are backing away from it. Then you have the AIIB on the left, which has a much larger membership than the countries that I actually had space to list here. So it's a very rapidly growing multilateral body. Again, this is not about exclusivity. Overall, I describe the rise of Asia as a new layer of paint on a global canvas. It's not eradicating or washing away the other colors, it's blending with them. Similarly, the AIIB, which actually Western commentators were thinking of as part of a BRI-linked plot for global hegemony, now appreciate that the AIIB actually has a significant amount of co-investment with the World Bank, with the ADB. It's a minority investor actually, or shareholder in a number of those projects. So let's not view this in either or terms. It's not Asia or the West, not East or West. It's a new layering. But the fact that Asia is finding ways to congeal without Western tutelage is very much on display here, not just here, but in other aspects as well. Now, the final couple of points I make will be specifically just on values and what we think of as values, with Neha's remarks as a very important preamble to this. Those younger listeners on this call or participants may not even remember the original articulation of Asian values. I have no doubt that many other speakers are going to address it today. But briefly, prior to the Asian financial crisis of 1998, the term was quite in vogue and then fell out of favor for well over a decade in light of the negative after effects and image that this notion of hierarchical, deferential, Confucian-driven, a model or system fell out of favor really during that time. What I tried to set myself the task to do about sort of 5 years ago when I was working on this Asia book was to say, well, if you were to start from scratch and really take Asia as a whole, not just Pacific, Confucian, East Asia, but all of Asia, and say that, well, now that Asian countries are having more interactions with each other, more demographic flows, trade, finance, investment, technology, and so forth, what would their societies have in common? Because after all, there isn't one type of regime in Asia, but what about society, sort of social level? And I tried to come up with 3, and I tried to make them as pithy as possible as well. So if you were to survey 4.5 billion people, right, most of whom will never meet each other or travel to each other's countries, what might they subconsciously or actively have in common? And I thought of these 3. The first is preference or acceptance of a technocratic style of government. This is not an antithesis to democracy, not at all, because most Asians live in democratic countries. This is something that I have to remind people on the other side of the world very, very regularly, unfortunately, but most Asians live in democracies. So this is not about discarding democracy at all, but it's a certain preference or tolerance or acceptance of a strong central executive authority for the purpose of having a long-term vision for national modernization and giving a certain leash or lengthy tenure to leaders who are following or pursuing that vision. And you can see that that's how politics, what we're seeing in places like India, Indonesia, and the Philippines, which are of course very large and populous Asian democracies. Part of that technocracy is of course having a very strong meritocratic independent civil service. And we see that here in Singapore, we see it in Japan and South Korea and Taiwan, Australia and New Zealand, not surprisingly, the countries that have done fairly well against the pandemic and that have now won praise around the world for being the places that have demonstrated the greatest competence in dealing with the pandemic. So there's no question that the pandemic experience has been a validation of Asian democratic technocracy. The second is mixed capitalism. I won't speak too much about it, but of course, Asians take for granted that there is a role for the government in the economy. The notion of laissez-faire economic, or capitalist systems is not germane to Asia, and of course there is a high share of government to GDP in Asia. You have strong industrial policies in Asian countries, and of course you have a crucial part of the picture, and I'm glad it was mentioned earlier, is the role of family business. Right? So, judging Asian economies' size or potential by the value of listed equities in their stock markets is not a useful metric because most Asian wealth is still in private hands. And that's part of the Asian business culture and economic culture that I think is very much worth preserving. So mixed capitalism is an Asian norm. And by the way, importantly, it's becoming a global norm, because no country can truthfully say today that it does not have an industrial policy. The United States, between the years 2007 and 2021, is nothing if not the story of a state becoming highly interventionist in its economy. And so again, in both of these first 2 new Asian values, you can see West leaning East rather than East leaning West, right? And the third is what I call social conservatism or incremental liberalism. Again, Neha mentioned collective duty and responsibility as things that Asians generally take for granted. And that is again true, of course, in democratic Asian societies as well. This is the area that is the most controversial and where there is least uniformity. Let me be absolutely clear, right? And this is an area where we ought to have the most vigorous debates, quite frankly, because who would argue against good governance? Who would argue against a state supporting innovation and creating jobs if that's an important role that it can play in an underdeveloped country? No, very little controversy there anymore. But I'm not someone who is going to actively condone, press censorship or actively condone subjugation of women or suppression of minority rights, of course, and none of us should. The question is, in what ways are we seeing countries dealing with them in a way that's Asian, in the sense that one wants to still preserve national stability in the context of fragile multi-ethnic societies. And this is a challenge that Asians are rightly very cautious in dealing with. And we can see, for example, in the case of the internet, what damage has been done to Western societies and the frailty that it is exposed by not paying heed to these notions of collective goodwill and benefit, and what sacrifices need to be made against just free speech in all manners or facets when it can harm collective stability. And one test case of this is, of course, internet regulation, because we've seen what happens with the manipulation of elections in Western countries by Twitter and Facebook, and allowing bots and private companies and so forth to have the same rights of speech and being able to spread fake news. Asians have rightly been very, very cautious about allowing the same to transpire here, which is why, again, a third case of West learning from East, you're starting to see internet regulations in Western societies start to mimic, in some ways, the caution that you have here in Asia. So again, a very controversial area, not one where I'm universally saying that Asian societies have a better model. Asians still have a lot to learn here about women's rights, a lot to learn about empowering creativity and entrepreneurship, and of course around empowering minorities beyond not just sort of tolerating them. So this is much more of a level playing field than other areas, but one where I do see, because the largest category of people in the world is young Asians, right? There's almost 2 billion young Asians. And so I see a lot of potential. This is a very dynamic area. We're seeing it on the streets of Myanmar and Thailand right now, for example. And I do have hope that the next generation of Asians, as they become leaders, will find that balance between collective responsibility and knowing how difficult the challenge of managing large and diverse populations is, but also enabling freedom, individualism, and creativity, and getting that balance right. And so the future of Asia does rest in the decisions that those 2 billion young Asians make. So just a montage of Asian faces to remind everyone of the incredible diversity of this region, truly the most diverse region of the world. And it truly always will be. And the question is, how can we continue to grow together in that diversity? Asia has done an incredible job of this overall in the past 30 years since the end of the Cold War. We can all hope and work towards the goal of the next 30 achieving that much again and more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Khanna. That was quite exhaustive. It was fascinating to read your book, and you really focused on trade self-reliance, infrastructure diplomacy, and Asian solutions to Asian problems. So you often talk about this Asianization of Asia as a system. So where do you think this is happening? Is it at this point of time, is it kind of stuck at the policy level among the decision makers? Or how far do you feel an average Asian has internalized this concept?
Oh boy, if there were such a thing as an average Asian, right? I mean, the beauty, let's see, of the Asian system is that it has happened without a premeditated design. The last 30 years of Arabs trading more with Asians, East Asians investing more in South Asia and Central Asia, playing a more prominent role in Central Asia as well. ASEAN in its own way, ASEAN societies, again, individuals, more freedom of movement, more intermarriage, more South Asians spreading out across into the rest of Asia. All of these things happen without central command and control, right? This is an organic process because it is natural. It is germane to Asian history over the last thousands of years. You don't need to tell Asians to do these things. You don't need to tell Asians to build a system. There is that intuitive understanding that it is part of our history, even if we're not educated in our own history. I mean, part of my motivation for writing the book was to write an Asian history of Asia, or Asia in global history, that doesn't rely on only national stories and allowing them to run in parallel, but rather showing how they stitch together. And so I obviously cannot claim that the average Asian gets it yet, but the average Asian is doing it even if they don't get it. And I do see some sort of virtue in that, even if we haven't told them all the story in a single voice.
Thank you. You touched upon, the potential of young Asians, who may not be so ethnocentric, or who may not embrace ethno-nationalism as the older generation in your book and right now. So my understanding is that you're predicting that there will be more internalization, or, more consciousness about an Asian identity as the coming younger generation assimilate more in universities, or, through intermarriages, as you said, or migration and so on, right? So if you look at if you look at Samuel Huntington, he talks about clash of civilization, right? He predicted that there is like the future, like post Cold War, it would be clash of identities and culture. So do you feel like you seem very optimistic about the prospect of younger generation bringing in a more optimistic embracing of Asian identity? So do you feel our Asian younger generation is going to really prevent the catastrophe Samuel Huntington was predicting?
Well, I mean, I don't think we need Asian young people per se to prevent a catastrophe that wasn't going to happen anyway, because there's too much wrong with the thesis to begin with. It was never going to be the way the world was going to be. So I don't need to argue against something that never was, right? Which is not to disrespect him in any way. I mean, of course, I cite him regularly and as a scholar that had a lot of influence on me, but not in this particular regard. When it comes, though, to your question, patriotism, nationalism, ethno-nationalism need to be distinguished from each other. And there is a dangerous ethno-nationalism that does pervade numerous Asian societies. There's no question about it. We are seeing it happening, in China and India and some of the most important countries. We're seeing Myanmar and elsewhere. This is highly problematic. It's not just old people who pervade, these mythologies and self-serving, of course, politics that still have a lot of territoriality as their motivators. Let's not forget, a lot of when people cloak themselves in religious dogmas or in ethno-chauvinist sort of mantras, let's remember that fundamentally it's also a geographical power play in the context of potentially a civil war or other kinds of territorial, let's say, secular disputes. So I think another important thing is not to take people's language in this regard at face value, to look not just at what they say, but what they are doing and how they stand to gain or lose. Young people certainly are, again, based on surveys and data and so forth, less susceptible or vulnerable to this kind of mythology, but their silence in many areas is certainly equivalent to deference. And so I do worry about it, but I do think also that if we can change the underlying material conditions, meaning if you have a conflict resolution or conflict settlement between two countries, then it is far less likely that that sentiment that has been cultivated by an older generation is going to persist simply for the sake of it. And I've looked at this in a number of ways. You mentioned intermarriage. I've also looked at student populations from one Asian country going to another Asian country. And you can see in Korea, right? You can see a large number of Chinese students and Japanese students and Korean students come together in Korea. That's not the kind of behavior that you would expect from an older generation. But you do have a youth melting pot effect in Singapore and in Hong Kong and in other cosmopolitan cities of Asia. So by and large, I think we're headed in the right direction. So history is not going to necessarily repeat itself in this regard, which is not to say there won't be conflict, right? There are major tensions, bilateral, regional tensions. There are at least 8 major conflict scenarios in Asia. Any one of them could break out, but none of them is going to break out because youth wanted them to, right? Let's be absolutely clear, right? The drivers are going to be different, secular, territorial, historical, diplomatic, driven by the elderly, right? Young Asians don't wake up, most of them don't wake up every morning saying, my foremost priority is to conquer my neighbor's territory, right? They're much more interested in domestic, prosaic concerns. Corruption will rank far higher in any survey of Asian youth as a concern. Education, jobs, corruption, than international conquest and mobilization. I've been doing some research for my next book around conscription policies, and countries like South Korea have conscription, Taiwan has conscription, Turkey has conscription, and so forth. And I can't find a single country in the world where young people actually want to participate in the most trivial level of conscription. Singapore may be the only exception. It's a small country. So that's just one data point in a much broader set of indicators that young people don't think like old people, and I think that's largely a good thing.
Thank you. I have two more questions. I know you won't be staying. I really hope that you could stay for the Q&A, but I'm just going to ask you two more questions. One is, you mentioned that family businesses, that is kind of leading the industries in Asian countries. It's kind of a good thing, and you mentioned that it may not be a bad idea to preserve it, but there's also a trust deficit that they bring into our countries, isn't it? Because there is definitely, it's not a level playing field. So do you think that is an Asian value that we should be proud of?
Is what an Asian value that we should be proud of?
The fact that family-owned businesses are given a preeminent role in our Asian countries. Do you think that's a good thing? Do you think that we should be proud of that as an Asian value?
So in the context of financial globalization, in which you have so much mobility of capital and so many Western companies, for example, are in this trap right now where they have offshored everything, where they've listed, family businesses have sold out really to financial markets, and therefore you have had a real, if you will, kind of deindustrialization process that's happened, high income inequality, gains really accruing to capital over labor, this sort of thing. So in that context, having a rootedness to companies, Japanese companies, Korean companies, they employ the largest share of their workforce at home. They pay good wages, they take care of families, they pay taxes, right? They participate in state-sponsored, modernization drives. That rootedness is extremely important for stability, for political stability, for economic stability, for national welfare. And in that sense, there's no doubt that you could consider that a virtue these days.
Okay, thank you. There is a problem of trust deficit, but I think we should get back to it after some time. There is a question from the audience. He or she wants to know that you talked about a switch from West to East rather than the reverse. How does this trend relate to the 2 billion young Asians on whom the future of Asia depends, in a way of idealization of Western culture? So how would you respond?
Well, this is where Samuel Huntington is extremely useful, because one of his several or many deep, great, profound, and relevant insights during his career was that modernization does not equal Westernization. And it's a point that he repeated ad nauseum in his career. And it was actually part of his Clash of Civilizations argument, the part that's probably the most long-lasting. And he said, look, just because, and this is actually an exact line from that book. He said, just because a Chinese person bites into a Big Mac, it doesn't mean that they buy all of the ideology associated with America. Right? That's exactly the sentence he wrote in that book. And I think that is a very useful way of understanding that just because China has become rich and modern, it's not necessarily going to become Western and democratic, or even liberal in the way that Western societies define liberalism. And that applies in many other places. So Asia is modernizing, yes. Asia is doing things that Western societies have done prior to them doing it, but it's simply modernizing. Modernization was not invented by the West per se, right? When you define things in terms of material advances, there are obviously periods of history where Asian societies have been materially ahead of the West, pre-industrial revolution. And now many Asian societies are becoming more materially advanced and wealthy than Western societies. So it's not about, are you becoming more Western than the West? It's a secular competition or comparison in the state of material development, right? Let's divorce the materialism from the geography and the ideology, even though it's difficult to do so. So are there young people who believe that modernity could only be achieved in the West, especially when you couple not just the material gains, but also the culture of liberalism and freedom that we also associate with modernity? Yes, there are many young Asians like that. But the majority of Asians, let's remember, stay in Asia. Of course, there are scholarship winners and wealthy families, send their children to study in Oxford or Harvard or whatever the case may be. But let's remember that's a very, very small minority, right? Most Asians stay in Asia. They're educated in Asia. They're raised in Asia. They appreciate Asian culture and values. And what you're seeing happening more and more is what it's called the phenomenon of repats, which is to say Asians who've gone to the West but moved back to Asia because they realize that the balance is better achieved here, right? Quality of life, family, multi-generational family structures and that kind of thing. So you're seeing, and again, the pandemic is absolutely going to bear this out, is that far fewer Asians are going to physically get up and move to North America, perhaps with the exception of Canada, in the near future. And that could wind up being a long-lasting trend. So I think that the next generation, no doubt, is materialistic, if we're going to generalize, and seeks to have all of the trappings of modernity, including greater political freedom and liberalism. Let's make no mistake that youth would prefer to have a political voice than not have a political voice. That's absolutely true in China as well, right? Just because they don't, it doesn't mean that they like it. But are they going to, again, do so in a way that appreciates, hopefully appreciates, the virtues of what got them to this stage of modernization, as opposed to being modern but becoming unstable, which is what you see happening in any number of very wealthy Western countries. And I think that people would prefer to have that balance.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khanna. It was a pleasure listening to you and kind of, having you here. I hope you can stay back through the program. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
So moving on, we are going to the next speaker. We have Professor Rebecca Chungee Kim. She is a professor at Ritsumeikan Asia Pacific University, Japan. She was a visiting scholar at the University of California, Berkeley. She has served as a visiting professor at Edinburgh University, UK, and University of Nottingham, Malaysia. She was a British Chevening scholar while she undertook her master's in management from the University of Strathclyde. She completed her doctorate degree from the same university. Today, she'll be presenting on value-oriented inclusive leadership of Asia. She will be giving us perspectives from a business management point of view. Dr. Rebecca, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Rich. And then thank you, everybody. This is my great pleasure to be here as a part of your great initiative of Asian leadership. So today, let me try to share some research in relation to Asian value. So can you see my screen, Litcy?
Yes, we can, Professor.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Okay, here am I. This is my school. This is my school. So let me try to point to where am I. I'm around here in order to meet you and then in order to make a great conversation with you about Asian leadership. So after COVID-19, when the new normal comes, please come to Japan and visit my school. As Litcy said, my main research area is comparative. You mean management field, especially in relation to corporate social responsibility, and the HRM, especially focused on leadership. So my view is much more focused on East Asia, such as Japan, Korea, South Korea, and China, confusing these kind of things. And some, you mean, insight from India as well. So I hope you like this kind of a very, you mean, a little bit different conversation and with you. Apparently, you said, and then Neha said, Kama said, apparently Asia will have the world's largest GDP and will lead the world. However, I have to make a confession. This is the religion at this moment. So why? By having the physical growth and the economic growth, can we say we can lead the world and the world can listen to us? So with what kind of method and what kind of way that you can lead the world? Actually, yeah, please, let's try to figure out our young days. In our young days, we are trying to grow and the physical growth. However, in our adolescence period, we are about to asking about ourselves. Yes, who am I? And then what is my identity? This is the exact time for Asia to think about. That's why I understand you organize this kind of thought-provoking, very important round the table for us to discuss. So this is a really challenging time for us. So by now, we did discuss about our economic growth and our world contribution to the world population. However, where is our identity? Where are our values? And then my next question is, if then how can we, Asia, lead or contribute to the sustainable development of the global society? That's my question. So I want to propose, and I want to ask you to ponder with me value-oriented inclusive leadership of Asia. So what is this? So my main research area is a comparative study between the West and East, or East and West. So I first tried to discuss about the distortions of current capitalism, and then where are we at this moment? To be honest, as a teacher, for you, I understand here so many business people you are here. So most of our themes and ideas are coming from the West, global standard approach in relation to SDGs, corporate social responsibility, deontology, utilitarianism, creating shared value, ethical leadership, authentic leadership, all kind of this kind of things are coming from the West. So we have to think about the if then what about the contribution or leadership from Asia? That's what I would like to share with you. Capitalist society, the two main themes, maximizing shareholder return and then maximizing profit, and then competitive advantage. It means competitiveness. However, now we can see, because of pandemic as well, we can see a lot of distortions. Of course, capitalism contributes to the world economic growth a lot. So this is crystal clear. However, at this moment, we are thinking a lot, and the researchers and the political leaders and the business people. So what's the problem of current capitalism? So I've tried to sort of express what is the main distortions, if then how we can solve this problem. The first thing is greed is good. According to the ontology, if you make the greatest good for the greatest number of people, it's quite famous, right? This is good. Bribery is good. Corruption is good. Whistleblowing is good. Everything is good if we create the greatest good for the greatest number of people. It's a distortion. And the second distortion is quarterly capitalism. The world is about talking about sustainable or long-term management. However, to be honest, in the real capitalist market, they are assessing on a quarterly basis. So business is really difficult to make the long-term or sustainable strategy. That's the dilemma of business people, especially in Asia. So when I've discussed with many Asian business people, the most difficult one or the most problematic things, the world standard or global standard of quarterly basis assessment. So what do you think here in this business people? And the third one is elitist capitalism. I think Neha mentioned about this a little bit. Big gap between the rich and poor, inequality. Because of pandemic, for example, in America, we can see the big gap between the rich and the middle. So how capitalism can contribute to tackle or to solve this kind of a problem? Still, we don't have this answer. The fourth one is volume-oriented capitalism. Again, the greatest good for the greatest number of people without acknowledging the small victims, without acknowledging environment kind of things. So therefore, we can see a lot of global problems in relation to sustainable development. The last one is one pattern capitalism. Yeah, this is related to the variety of capitalism. And as Khanna mentioned, the capitalism in Asia is quite different. Of course, the America leads this kind of a capitalist society. However, as you may observe, in Japan, we have kind of coordinated capitalism. In Korea, we have this kind of plutocratic and Chaebol oriented capitalism or state-led capitalism. Somebody say this is network capitalism, China, autocratic capitalism, and the Singapore, much more open state-led capitalism. India, much more hybrid market capitalism. Therefore, capitalism is quite diverse according to their historical, institutional, or cultural background. The context, Neha mentioned the very important things, context. So we have to think about the capitalism in a context way. So if then, what shall we do? So how we can find the new leadership of future capitalism? Pandemic asked us this kind of a very important question. If then we have to think about what about the role of Asian leadership and the role of Asian business? Of course, during these days, we observe a lot of contribution of business people from here and there, from the West and from Asia. How inclusive they are, how they can contribute to the sustainable development of the global world, the history will assess them. So let's try to much more focus on the management field. Litcy mentioned I challenge to Michael Porter. Yes, one of my paper is about the creating shared value of Asia. So I've tried to discuss about Asian creating shared value in comparison with Michael Porter's idea on creating shared value. I have to say very different, very different. Capitalism is under siege, and we have to rethink capitalism is almost the same. And most companies remain stuck on social responsibility mindset. So we have to change this mindset because business is not Santa Claus. So we don't expect any return in relation to our corporate social responsibility. Michael Porter said that this is wrong. So what do you think? What do you think? So Michael Porter suggests that there is this kind of a hybrid field. Business have to create the business value as a strategy. At the same time, business should create the social value. So there is the hybrid part, and he said this is creating shared value. If then, what about Asia? What about Asia? What do you think? So I have to listen to your voice also, business people, if you are here. I've discussed about this issue with about 80 business people here in Asia, Japan, South Korea, India, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Philippines, and Vietnam. And they are talking about CSV in a very, very different voices. Creating shared value, or CSR, or social contribution philanthropy, let's make it as a simple. This is not the business strategy here in Asia. So if you say creating shared value as a business strategy, one of the quotation from Japanese government official, he said, we will not trust you. We will not trust the business because you have to create the shared value with the community. As Neha said, the community is one of the most important stakeholders in Asia, unlike the Western freedman's stakeholder value. So beyond the business strategy, this is all about business survivor here in Asia. So this is not the new one. Many Japanese business people, they said, this is the traditionally our idea, creating shared value, because the motivation of a business and the identity of a business is not to maximize shareholder return, is not to create benefit. So here in Asia, we have a different value. I know India, you are talking about this kind of things in relation to spirit or religion. It was my surprising impression. I've learned a lot when I visited in India and discussed with the Indian business people. So these are all about business values. And the lucrative CSV, what Michael Porter said, it should create the profit because business is not Santa Claus. However, when it comes to Asia, no. If you say about CSV as a lucrative or a profitable approach, we will not trust you again. This is all about trust. This is all about ethical identity, business. This is institutional trust as well. And one of you mentioned about that. So here in Asia, everything is all about institutional norm and the institutional trust, unlike Western society. So business, they have to get the trust from the society. This is kind of also, they are very interactive, but this is a must for business to survive here in Asia. So for example, when I did have an interview with the vice president of one of the biggest international company in India, and then he shared this kind of dilemma. So we are one of the biggest international company in the world. However, when it comes to India, you ask us to share our business strategy idea with your value. This is our dilemma. So if then, how Western companies, when they come to Asia, how they can make their business strategy? So many multinational companies, especially Western companies, they have this kind of dual strategy. internally, they are talking about sharing value as a business strategy, but externally, when they discuss about this with Indian community, Korean community, or Vietnamese, Japanese community, they talk about this as their social contribution. Again, in this time, I don't want to say which is right or wrong. This is really up to you. But Asian approach is like this. And then one more very important approach when it compared to West is West, they are talking about creating shared value, much more focused on business for the society. You have to contribute to the society. You have to contribute to the global society. However, here in Asia, business, you are the fabric or DNA of the community, society. So this business and society, they are not pitted against each other. They have to live together. So very different view. Business for society versus business in the society. So as you may observe, a very different view between Asia and the West. If then, what are the Asian values? How this kind of values are integrated into Asia? So because time is against us, I don't want to explain these all Asian values, but as you may observe, I can see some kind of conceptual framework from Asian values. So 3 key points. One is about harmony. And the one is about normative ethics. And the one is much more about long-term value. Especially in East Asia, kind of China, Japan, Korea, they are talking about harmony. And then you mentioned about the collective responsibility. This is exactly true. So according to Guanxi, according to Confucianism, we have to live together. We have to make the harmony with the community. So this is all about Asian value and normative ethics. It means we have to get the social trust. And especially here in Japan, we have a high score of conflict avoidance. This is not for the efficiency, but for Japanese. I observe this is a norm. This is ethic. And in terms of normative ethics, it's also related with empathy and the save and investment for the long term. Yeah, you can see technically these all kind of Asian values are interact with each other. If then I ask to myself, so what?
Rebecca, yeah, you have a few more minutes.
Okay, so what? So what kind of, you mean main thought that I can have this one, I can create this one. This is all about inclusivity. Inclusivity through harmony, through normative ethics, through long-term value. So I would like to suggest the value-oriented inclusive leadership of Asia. So what is inclusive leadership? By now, I think here in this center, you have a lot of experts in terms of leadership. So leadership is mainly, we are focusing on the discussion from the leader, how leaders, they exhibit their power. However, during these days, it has been changed, much more sharing value, I have to say. So we do not need an exceptional leader. It means my country, first or last, cannot exhibit or cannot accept it in this very interconnected global society. You can observe. So inclusive leadership is all about belongingness and uniqueness and how leaders, they can communicate authentically to enhance the trust and loyalty and restore the balance between economy and ecology. So inclusive leadership is more than relational process. So this is my final kind of thought. By having this conceptual framework, global business in modern capitalist society, they have this kind of challenge and dilemma with this kind of double aim and standard.
Geez,
They have to develop,
we have just about a minute to wrap this
economy,
up.
and they have to develop society. And then build a sense of economic leadership, and you've discussed a lot. However, at the same time, build a sense of societal leadership. They have to be prepared for assessment of financial impact and social impact. However, businesses, they cannot do at this moment. So issue of sustainable business. If then, how to tackle about this one? So I would like to suggest, so why don't we bring Asian value of harmony and normative ethics and the long-term value? If then, it will be hard to develop society. However, more than that, we can create value-oriented inclusive leadership of Asia. If then, it may help to build inclusive
Rebecca, you may have like 1 minute to
global
wrap up.
society.
Thank you.
All right. So my question is about, my last question is, however, the world, they don't recognize us, Asia, or misinterpret Asian value, such as unethical guanxi, corruption, kind of things. If then, we have to ponder on why. And after that, we have to think about how and to what extent we lead the sustainable development of global society by using Asian value. Look forward to your views and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Rebecca. That was enlightening. So you talked about, values and, the long-term perspective that Asians take and inclusive leadership. But if you really look at, many Asian leadership, across regions, you can't really deny that there is a hierarchic hegemony. Mahindra supporting India during COVID, or, various business leaders stepping in towards contributing towards social value. It may be outliers sometime, but across, you can't really deny the hierarchic hegemony. Like Samsung holds 30% of the stock market in South Korea or in Japan and so on. So how would you really see this creating shared value, realizing and becoming more egalitarian across different levels of businesses? Like not just at the top, but middle and lower levels. Will there be an equal playing field?
Very good question. And then, to be honest, this is the dilemma. And the many Western scholars and also many Western business, and they have a dilemma when they come to Asia. So this kind of a hierarchical relationship. So let me share about the Confucianism, I think a little bit. In terms of Confucianism, we have unnun. So it means much more hierarchical responsibility. The father, they have to take care of their son. And then the son should respect. And then follow the order of the father. And then husband and wife. And the other, this kind of unnun. So very hierarchical. Not equal collaboration, not equal relationship. So if whether this is right or wrong, this kind of things, for example, here in Japan, a lot of people, when they have a meeting, although they don't agree with the opinion, because of the conflict avoidance, high score of a conflict obedience, they have to make a silence. This is a kind of a hierarchical relationship. Whether this is good or not, or how this kind of cultural or historical kind of relationship can contribute to solve the problem of the global society, this is another issue. So we have to think
Rebecca, we
about
have
that.
like 2 experts who are waiting to ask you questions.
All right.
We
I
have
really like
Professor
questions.
Muluan Wu from
Mhm.
LKY School of Public Policy. Professor, would you ask your question at this time?
Yeah, I just unmute myself.
And if we, if we can,
Yes.
I think we are running
Yeah,
short of
yeah.
time. So if we can all keep our questions brief and the responses brief,
Yeah.
it would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Because I research on corruption, so my question would be, how would you address some question like non-transparency, particularly in Asian culture? For example, I research China and Indians anti-corruption. Then we find that the transparency issue is a common issue among these two contexts. So how would you think about that, and also think about as a kind of Asian value?
Thank you, Dr. Wu. This is really a great question. And this is one of the dilemma for Asian business. Corruption or transparent issue, this is one of the key issues in business. However, this is also a key issue of the whole society, including political arena. It means, let me share the South Korean case, Jaeber, Saibetju, and the Neha you mentioned. And then Jaebers, and they have a really good relationship with the Korean government. It means many people, they think this is unethical or corrupted relationship between politics and the big elite and the Jaebers. However, when business, they are talking about it without, they don't say this is corrupted. Without this cozy relationship between politics and the business, we cannot survive. This is all about our contribution to the global society. Actually, I've learned in Scotland, and then at the place they said absolutely corruption is wrong according to the ontology or the other Western theory. However, when it comes to Asia, such as China or the other countries, so Huaishi also related, you mean a lot of criticism in relation to corruption as well. So it means this is not only the business, you mean problem, but also this is a problem around the institutions. So if then how we can settle this kind of a problem, it will take time, I think, for the long term. So this is one of the biggest dilemma for Asian business. Although we said this is a really great Asian value of cooperation and harmony, but as Dr. Wu mentioned, this is one of the critical issues. Thank you. Thank you for your great question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rebecca. We do have one more question from Sabrina, who is an ILO specialist.
Mm-hmm.
I hope the question would be brief and the response would be brief. Thank you. Okay, we can get back to Mr. Sabrina during the question answer session. Thank you so much, Professor Rebecca, for that presentation, really kind of bringing out Asia's potential and Asia's, traditional culture of, shared value, and really giving an alternative to the stereotypes about capitalism and, a solution to the toxicity that capitalism brings in to the global world. So it's really a breath of fresh air. So thank you. The next speaker is a much awaited Ambassador Belahari Kausikan. He was a former permanent secretary at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Singapore. He served as the ambassador to the United Nations, Russian Federation, and Israel. He served 37 years in the Singapore Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Following his retirement, he was ambassador at large and policy advisor at Singapore's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He was a chairman of the Middle East Institute in the National University of Singapore. But he's affectionately labeled by his colleagues as the undiplomatic diplomat, because he's one of those rarest diplomats who actually shows the courage to speak to power and to call a spade a spade. Today, he'll be enlightening us on the geopolitics of human rights in Asia. Thank you so much, Ambassador, for joining us. We look forward to hearing the enlightening thoughts that you always give your audience. The stage is yours.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me to speak to you today. One small correction, I have never been ambassador to Israel, although I visit that country very often. I'm going to speak to you about the geopolitics of human rights, and specifically about the Asian values debate of the early 1990s. That debate engaged, at least for a time, such towering figures as Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore, Muhammad Mahathir of Malaysia, Kim Dae-jung of South Korea, and Shintaro Ishihara of Japan. As a very, very minor participant in that debate, I can state from my personal experience that, at least for Singapore, the debate was only secondarily about values and primarily about geopolitics. Values were instruments for geopolitical ends. I don't suggest that every individual or country that participated in that debate had exactly the same motivations. Obviously, they did not. But what linked them was that at bottom, their motivations were political, and were political whether they were conscious of it or not. This is inherent in the nature of human rights, or values in general. More than 60 years ago, the political scientist David Easton defined politics as, and I quote, the authoritative allocation of values, end of quote. I haven't found a better definition, and it's one that applies equally appropriately to international as well as domestic politics. It certainly applies to the politics and geopolitics of human rights. I don't have time to go into details, but a moment's reflection must, I think, lead any reasonable person to the conclusion that the historical process by which the revolutionary idea that human beings have rights by virtue of their humanity, and that our common humanity gives us an interest in the rights of others, grew, gathered force, and entered into the intellectual mainstream, was inescapably political. How could it be otherwise? Ideas never prevail merely on the basis of their inherent merits. They have to be fought for. The fights are conditioned by their political and historical contexts and cannot be fully understood, devoid of their context. Even the noblest of ideals are never just noble ideals, but are also weapons or instruments deployed for specific purposes. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights grew out of the horrors of the Second World War and the Holocaust, and the determination that they never be repeated. That the ideals of the Universal Declaration have always been honored more by their breach than their observance does not detract from the fact that its adoption in 1948 represents, at least in theory, a substantial modification of Westphalian principles and practices. Now, how much modification is the result of specific negotiations over particular cases and differs from case to case. These negotiations are inescapably political, and the animating value of any political process is power. Power. It is therefore a fool's errand to look for or try to impose any consistency on the outcomes of specific negotiations, except in the trite sense that power will almost always prevail, bearing in mind there are various types of power, of course. The Asian values debate grew out of the specific circumstances of the end of the Cold War. Specifically, it grew out of the hubris that infected American and more generally Western foreign policies during the early 1990s. That hubris in turn stemmed from the tendency to view the end of the Cold War not just as another, albeit momentous, not just as another geopolitical event in a geopolitical dynamic that will continue as long as international relations are primarily shaped by a system of sovereign states, but as the very denouement of history itself. Now, today, the absurdity of the idea is self-evident, but it was not self-evident at the time to the US and its allies in Europe who claimed universality for their particular definitions of human rights and values. If rights and values are indeed universal, they are only universal at such a high level of generality that they prescribe nothing that is practically useful about how society should organize themselves. because the organization of particular societies can never be separated from their specific historical, cultural, and economic circumstances. It has always seemed to me to be self-evident that history and culture assert a profound influence on social, political, and economic development. How societies organize themselves will, of course, evolve as circumstances change. But evolution is not to be understood in any teleological manner as a one-way journey forever up and on towards the light. But these, what I consider common sense observations, were fiercely contested at the time. The beginning of the 1990s was, moreover, a period of great potential geopolitical complication. China was beginning to take off. Freed of the constraints of their de facto anti-Soviet alliance, the US and China were beginning to eye each other warily, particularly after the Tiananmen incident. President Bill Clinton was elected in 1993 after accusing his predecessor of coddling dictators. When Clinton was elected, the Democrats had been out of power for about 2 decades, except for the short and exceptionally disastrous Carter presidency that even Democrats were eager to forget. Our concern was that an inexperienced administration seemed somewhat more than merely inclined to give human rights and democracy promotion a more prominent role in US relations with China than we thought these matters warranted. Because these were matters on which the Chinese Communist Party would never yield. The potential for trouble seemed great, and if trouble broke out in US-China relations, it would have roiled and unsettled our entire region. Singapore had, in addition, just expelled an American diplomat for interfering in our domestic politics. His intentions were good. I knew him personally. His intentions were good. Inspired by the passions and delusions of those times, he wanted to herd and hasten the political heathen, that's us, by the way, along the path of righteousness. But we all know where good intentions proverbially lead us. This then was the context of the Asian values debate from Singapore's perspective. Our goals were defensive and modest, to encourage our friends in America and Europe to take a less simplistic view of political development in our region, and buy some time for the passions of a new administration to cool and allow common sense and the sobering imperatives of real politics to reassert themselves, as they eventually did. And once they did, we set aside the debate as having served its purpose. That debate then became only of academic interest, but it was only a postponement, not a resolution. We are today once again in a period of great geopolitical complication, in which US-China strategic competition is a new structural reality of international relations. The 20 or so years that the Asian values debate brought, the time it brought, has shaped and conditioned the context in which strategic competition between the US and China will now play out. This new context is the primary reason why describing that competition as a new Cold War, as many have, is an inappropriate and intellectually lazy trope. US competition is fundamentally different from earlier US-Soviet competition. The US and China compete for dominance over a single global system in which they are enmeshed in supply chains of a scope, density, and complexity that makes complete across-the-board decoupling highly improbable, whereas the Soviet and US competition was between two separate systems, connected only tangentially, and this is a very fundamental difference. The pandemic and the different responses to it have nevertheless again brought questions about how societies should organize themselves to the fore. At this time, the hubris seems more on the Asian side, specifically the Chinese side. Asia is not one politically, and despite the growing economic connections, I doubt that it will ever be one politically. It was a strategic mistake for China to have prematurely abandoned Deng Xiaoping's sage policy of hiding capabilities and biding time. And this was a strategic mistake because it is an irrevocable, irretrievable mistake. Once exposed, ambitions will not be easily forgotten and will inevitably provoke a counter-reaction, as we are today already witnessing. The root cause of the mistake was to regard one of the bouts of self-doubt, angst, and self-flagellation that Western societies periodically subject themselves to as a permanent condition. It's not a permanent condition. It's gone through it many times, it's always recovered, and it will no doubt go through these bouts of angst many times in the future and recover in the future. I again don't have time to go into details, but I would once again caution against hasty and simplistic conclusions or investing particular events like the pandemic with sweeping significances. The Chinese Leninist system and Western democracies both have their own strengths and their own dysfunctionalities, and it is premature to draw definitive conclusions from their responses to the pandemic. I'll be happy to elaborate on this during question time, but let me just point out now that Taiwan, whose political system is far more akin to, although not precisely similar to, Western systems than the Chinese systems, has also done well in containing the pandemic. So too have Japan, South Korea, and Singapore, whose systems are nothing like the Chinese system, done well in containing the pandemic. The successes of these diverse Asian systems might perhaps point in the direction of what I said a moment ago about the influence of history and culture. A final thought. I do not consider the pandemic as having had a seminal effect, at least not yet. So far, its effect has been far more to accelerate political, economic, and technological trends that were already evident before we knew that there was such a thing as COVID-19. It was much more to accelerate these trends than to fundamentally change their trajectories. I'll end here. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Belahari, for your thoughts on on human rights. So you mentioned that, you mentioned the impracticality of the Westphalian as well as universal ideals of, human rights. Do you feel that there is politicization of Asian values by Asian countries to suit certain political outcomes? I'm sure there is politicization of Western countries, which you mentioned, but do you think there is politicization of Asian values by Asian countries?
Values, human rights are inevitably political, whether they're used by the West or the East. It's inherent in their very nature. The West had one set of values which is touted as universal. I don't believe in universality, as I said, except at such a high level of generality, right? Thou shalt not kill. But what does it say about abortion? What does it say about capital punishment? What does it say about due process and so on? I can give you many examples. You know them, right? So it's not very practical as a prescription of how society should organize themselves. But they are part of the international discourse. And that discourse is between sovereign states, at least, always political. Whether you use rights and values as the instruments of a political agenda, or whether you use other instruments, and there are many. This is one of the tools of statecraft. And I think that's simple as that. By the way, I don't think that the Westphalian system is impractical. I think it has been substantially modified in particular cases by this new moray, shall we say, or this new discourse on human rights and values. But it is the fundamental basis of the state system. And I really don't see it being changed in any essential way for the foreseeable future.
Thank you, Ambassador. So Asians are generally kind of perceived as a very tolerant community, but when it comes to the Asian values have often used cultural relativism as a way to justify our political system. But do you feel that there is a level of intolerance towards diversity of voices?
No, I think this idea that Asians are very tolerant is not nonsense. That's the ideal, is not the reality in many countries. All the examples, all right? It's simply not true, all right? We are no more tolerant or intolerant than anybody else, all right? And this is a part of being human, all right? Okay? It's of course used. I mean, I said any country's political system is embedded in its history, its culture, its particular circumstances. Now, those circumstances are not static. They evolve. They evolve in response to changing circumstances. Now, values must have utility. If they cease to be useful, they will be abandoned or replaced by other values. And it's simple as that, right? And I think this is quite natural. It's not something that's peculiarly Asian. It is also Western. Let me give you an example. I said in my presentation that we shouldn't see this process of evolution as teleological. It's not up and on towards the light, right? Think of the, let's say, refugees, the right to asylum. Now, Singapore has never recognized the right to asylum. For the obvious reason, we're a very small place. If we do, everybody will move here, and where will we live, right? And for that, we were roundly criticized by the Europeans, by Australians and others. This was during the end of the 70s, early 80s. Now look at them. Look at what Australia has done to its refugees. Look at how there's been pushback against refugees in Europe. Circumstances change cases. And values is simple. Things evolve, but they do not always evolve in one direction. And there will always be, against a particular evolution, a counter-reaction. You look at the counter-reaction against, say, the values of multiculturalism in many Western societies. It's natural. This is the dynamic of history.
Thank you, Ambassador. We do have a question from Mr. Sabrinad, of an expert from the ILO. Mr. Sabrinad, could you please unmute yourself and ask your question? I think the admin may have to unmute Mr. Sabrinad.
Or perhaps to save time, you could read out her question.
Yeah. Neha, would you like to ask your question at this time?
Professor Belahari, it's very interesting to hear from you. Well, I sort of agree with you on the fact that everything comes with the domain of politicization. But on a more practical level, as a group, we are trying to look at how can we mainstream this discussion in Asian values a lot more than it is right now. And naturally, we are going to encounter the political, sort of resistance of that. How do we actually go around it? Is it with more evidence? Is it by putting more evidence at the center? Is it by many of us speaking together about it? What would your advice be to us as we sort of embark on this program? And then we'll bring in Shabrina from ILO.
Well, first of all, I don't think there's any consensus about what are exactly Asian values, except again, in a very general sense. I think we are a bit more community-oriented and so on. But you just look, Dr. Khanna had 3 values, right? Professor Kim had a different 3 values. And there's some overlap, but they're not exactly the same. And I would bet you anything, if we just polled all of us on the panel, we would have a different set. So I think we will have to set that as a starting point. And then again, I think the test is utility. Is it useful for our societies? Do they make our societies a better place? Do they help us with the problems of the day-to-day problems of governance that we all face? And we don't face the same problems. Of course, obviously Singapore, a fairly developed and wealthy city-state, has different problems from, say, Nepal or even India. And in India, the problems in Mumbai may not be the same as the problems in, well, I know, Bihar or something like that, right? So for me, the criteria is utility. So let's not worry too much about Asian values or Western values or African values or Middle Eastern values. Let's talk about what values are most useful to solve the problems that our societies face at different times in our history or in different places in our society.
Absolutely, agree with that. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Mr. Shabari, you can ask your question now.
Thanks so much, Litcy. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yes, we can. We are so sorry about the technical.
No, that's perfectly fine.
Glitches.
Ambassador Belahari, what an absolute pleasure for me to come just after you. I like what you said. Asians are no more tolerant or intolerant than anybody else, right? And I think that's a great takeaway message, because what I felt right at the beginning was we were romanticizing the Asian value system. And I think we need to get away from that, right? I mean, I can see a big smile on Litsy's face, because it is true. We tend to think that our values are bigger and better than anybody else's. I mean, if you go to Africa, they'll talk to you about Ubuntu. If you go to Latin America, they'll talk to you about the solidarity of community. So let's not perhaps think that we are better than anybody else. I'm the regional migration specialist for the ILO for South Asia. The moment you talk about migration in the region, that is enough to shatter the myth of Asian values, because that is when you realize there is no Asian value. There perhaps is an Indian value and a Bangladeshi value and a Pakistani value, but not necessarily a South Asian value. I want to put it in three different perspectives, and I'll stop there quickly. It's to say, one, this: I don't understand Asia, the region. I don't understand the geography that is Asia, because we hear in the first speaker's presentation about West Asia and Australia and Russia. Sorry, what is Asia? And where do we start and where do we begin and end the borders of Asia? What is the geography of Asia? Let's define that. Let's understand that. Two, let us understand the intersectionality that religion and politics play in Asian values. Each one of these perspectives of religion and politics are important in how we define ourselves, in how our community works. And three, and this is directly related to Professor Rebecca's very important point about corruption. Here's my thing. I'm not an economist. I certainly don't work by capitalist thinking, but here's my thing. I remember once it was very well said, wasn't it, Ambassador Belahari, the founding leader of Singapore, who said, if you give peanuts, you get monkeys, in the context of corruption, right? So let's also then look at it in the context of South Asia, where they say, in some countries, corruption is over the table. In some countries, corruption is under the table. And in some countries, corruption includes the table. Okay. If corruption is going to affect the day-to-day lives of the common person, the lay person, then it does not contribute to a common good. We need to move away from that. This is not to be looked at just from a business perspective or an economic perspective. I'll stop there. Thanks a lot, Litcy.
Just one quick comment in response. I agree with much of what you said, but let me just stress a point. What is Asia and where is Asia and what are Asian values depends on what we want to use these concepts for. They are instruments. During the early 1990s, we stressed a particular group of concepts. Generally, I would say communitarian, right? Because of a particular problem we faced from some Western countries at that time, right? And once the problem was solved or the Western countries lost interest in it, we too lost interest in the debate. It's, my criteria may be simplistic, but it's utilitarian.
Ambassador, since you talked about communitarian values, I just have a question for you that, you know, when it comes to countries, we really talk about this communitarian values to justify governance. But when you look at the regional level, many a times Asian countries would come with more national priorities and overlook the communitarian value of a pan-Asian community. So doesn't it contradict the very communitarian principle that is used to justify Asian governance?
I think the idea of a pan-Asian community is a myth, a fantasy, and it doesn't exist, right? The communitarian values are always nationally grounded. Sometimes they are tribally grounded. Sometimes they're grounded in one particular sub-ethnicity or linguistic community. They are never, sometimes they're not even nationally grounded, but if insofar as they can be, they should be nationally grounded. Pan-Asianism, you know, this idea Asia is one that arose in the early 20th century is, you know, that we are somehow more spiritual or aesthetic or something than Westerners is rubbish.
Thank you, Ambassador. I hope you'll be able to stay for the question answer session. We have.
I'll stay.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for your insightful thoughts. Now we have another amazing speaker, Dr. Amitav Mukherjee. He was a former advisor to the government of India in the Ministry of Rural Development, New Delhi. He was the executive director in the Development Tracks RTC, a knowledge enterprise in Delhi. At the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, UNESCAP, Bangkok, Dr. Mukherjee served as a senior expert in the macroeconomic policy and development division. He was the head of the United Nations Asian and Pacific Center for Agricultural Engineering and Machinery in Beijing and the United Nations Center for Poverty Alleviation in Indonesia. Today, Dr. Amitav Mukherjee will talk to us about, are there Asian values? He's going to challenge the concept of Asian values. Dr. Mukherjee, the stage is yours.
Let me adjust my camera a bit.
It looks okay. It looks great.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be invited to this panel. Unfortunately, my views are the views of an heretic. In fact, all my life, my views have always been a minority view. And I rejoice at that, one of my teachers told me that the fact that you have a minority view shows that you don't swim with the tide. You have something to think about. Okay, so thank you very much. First, let me preamble my talk by saying that I will confine myself to values per se, or Asian values per se. I will not go into the larger questions of governance, socialism, capitalism, whatever you have. I will confine myself to the subject given to me, which is essentially Asian values. Now, what are values? Values are beliefs you put into operation, right? Values emerge out of a long struggle of customs, usage, practice, struggle, war, what have you. And values are not static. Values are dynamic. For instance, the concept of in the Indian context particularly, we had values at different points in time, right? Like the 2,500 years before Christ, the value was ahimsa paramo dharma. Ahimsa was the value. We changed over the years until again Gandhi in the 20th century reinvented it and installed it as non-violence in his fight against colonialism. So this is the broad context in which I will argue. This thing is moving, I don't know.
Dr. Mukherjee, you can control your slides, or if you want us to do that, we can do that too. How would you like it?
You can do it. That will be easier for me, please.
Okay. Kali Meeram, if you can take care of the slides, that will be helpful for Mr. Mukherjee.
Now, if you see this question of Asian versus non-Asian has emerged in in world history several times. Samuel Huntington's classification of the West versus the rest, which George Bush articulated in a more, what we would say, crude form of saying either we are with us or we are against us during the Iraq War. Now, if you see Huntington's classification of the globe, he says that the blue part is the Western part, that is Canada, basically the United States, the Western Europe, Australia, and New Zealand. Then the green part, which is North Africa, Middle East, parts of Indonesia as Islamic. Then the blue on the top, which is essentially what used to be the USSR, that is Russia, Moldova, Central Asian countries like Georgia, Azerbaijan. He says this is the Orthodox part. The green part, which is Mongolia, parts of China, which is Tibet, Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam, this part, Burma, he said this is Buddhist. India, Nepal, he says these are all Hindu. Then the gray, lower Africa is African. And then we have the Latin American part, which is the mauve color. And the light lilac, which is Japan, he classifies as Japanese. So there are various, this is useful what I mean to say. If you have these classifications, whether you agree with Huntington or not, the fact of the matter is that religion is a very, very strong influence in determining our value system. Throughout history, even now, religion is a critical factor in determining the values that we imbibe, that we practice, that we follow. Now, next slide, please. So based on this classification of the world, Huntington had this thesis that the central axis of the world politics will be a conflict between the West and the non-Western civilization. West civilization is Canada, United States, Western Europe, Australia, and New Zealand. The rest of the non-Western civilization, the whole of Africa, whole of China, whole of India, whole of Middle East says that. And what Stuart Hall had said, with the West and the rest. Now, this classification is very important. We'll come to it a little later when I say there are no Asian values. There are values. Values can be continental. Values can be, for instance, in the Indian context, it is continental, because India is the first country of continental proportions. We are not a country in that sense of the term. Then we have values which can be communal, that we are community-based. There can be local values. The values, sources of values are also different. Values can be, if it is the value of the nation, it is enjoined in the constitution as by law established. If it is a value of a leader like Mahathir Mohamad, Ali Gauyan, it is their value system which they have, by their popular support, they have been able to convey to their subjects, to their citizens, and one appreciation. The values can be different within the country. They can be very different connotations of value. Now, next one, please. Now, when you say this is a similar dichotomy when you say Asian values. This is a cultural relativism. This is what Amartya Sen said. It's a cultural relativism. West is essentialized as a homogeneous entity which has certain value systems. West is not homogeneous. It is as heterogeneous as we are. So we come to the next. So this cultural relativism is a little bit of a problematic thing when you are talking of Asian values. Next. Now, what are Asian values? According to the traditional, what Ambassador Belahari said, the traditionally Asian values. Asians' values were consensus, harmony, unity, and community. That's what we believed in the communal life. We believed in unity of people, harmony, consensus building. These are very good values. I am not challenging the values. But the problem with these values is when you build consensus, you also stifle the minority voices. On the other hand, if you see the Western, the non-Asian values, there's absence of consensus. There is no consensus. Therefore, there is democracy. There is debate. There is dissent. There is a question of voting, if you would like. There is conflict. Conflict is also a very important source of growth. The chaos theory is all based on conflict. If it is all homogeneous, if there is no conflict, there is no conflict of ideas, there is no conflict of approaches, progress may be seriously hampered. Then the other value is individualism, absence of the other, that means the Western value is individualism, in contrast to community values in the Asian continent. Now, the next one, well, this is not necessarily a neat classification. We'll come to it later. Next one, please. Now, the Asian value theory argues that human rights are not universal. There is a seed of difficulty for me into that. Asian societies are centered on family and not individual, which is in some cases true, in some cases not true. As the ambassador said, there cannot be a pan-Asian concept. So therefore, I doubt if there can be a pan-Asian value system as well. Now, then the most difficult thing about the Asian value, according to me, is that a nation's right to self-determination includes a government jurisdiction over human rights. Other nations cannot get into human rights abuses. That is, the rights of a state overrides the rights of an individual. If the state wants my liberty to be curtailed because of its own goal, it can curtail my liberty. Now, that's the problematic issue. Anyway, these are the core claims of the Asian values. Next. That this origin of the concept of the Asian values, in fact, emerged at the 1993 Conference on Human Rights in Vienna. Next, actually it was first articulated by the then Foreign Minister of Singapore. The universal recognition of human rights can be harmful. And then there was the spokesman for the Chinese ministry said that individual must put the state rights before their own. That means the individual has to voluntarily surrender its rights over the rights of the state. These were where it evolved since, but that to me was very, very significant. This conference was germane to the development of Asian value concept after this. Next one, please. I have to leave, so I'm rushing through a bit. Next. Now, are there really Asian values? This is the question which has haunted me, not today, but when I worked in the UN system also. That's what the ambassador said. You know, this pan-Asianism it can be religion, it is possible, but in political sense and in sense of right is difficulty. The 60% of the world population live in this area. For such a large population with such diversity, if we take values which can cut across boundaries, cut across religions, cut across customs, cut across religion, cut across every other aspect which governs human relationship, is somewhat problematic. That is why I argue that there is no quintessential value that apply to this immensely large and heterogeneous population that differentiates Asians in the group from the rest of the world. We are part of the world. We contribute to the world. We have value systems. The world has value systems. That is, I again get back to Ambassador Belahari's question there. That Bombay's problem in India is not the same as the problems of Bihar, therefore, or say Calcutta, Bengal. Culturally, we are very different. Therefore, values which can work in Maharashtra, Bombay is in the state of Maharashtra, or in the state of Gujarat, need not work or does not hold true for values in West Bengal or Bihar. There's a question which was someone mentioned there, I think Khanna mentioned it, that the family, one family in India, I'm not naming it for controversy, has made a large empire. That family belongs to Gujarat. The Gujarat's value system is business based. They have a different attitude. They have a different aptitude. The same, that is why large families which are very successful business are from Rajasthan or Gujarat in India. I've just used this illustration. There aren't such empires in Eastern India because the values are different. Their problems are different. The ambassador was right. The values must be relevant for solving a problem. It is not an utopian concept. So there are different values within the country. There are values different between the different countries. Next. Next, please. Oh, that's the same question I've already spoken about. It can we conceive Asia as one entity? It is kindly trying to say that beyond to the left of the Bosporus Strait is one whole world, and to the right of the Bosporus Strait there is a different world. This is heroic generalization. It is tough. One can do it, but I think that it's a little bit difficult. We can't do that generalization. Next. If you look at the traditional debate of Asian values, they are essentially values, and when they're contrasted, values which are propagated mostly in countries to the east of Thailand. You know, if India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, China, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, Burma, Bhutan, Sikkim, they were different. They have never been in the discourse. The discourse has always been in relation to the countries east of Thailand, right? So, and then there were some claims that the values in the subcontinent of India, in Pakistan, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, was similar to the Southeast Asian values. I call this South Asian East Asian values. There are similarities, there are overlaps, but they are not exclusive. They're different. Values vary from country to country, region to region. And definitely when you talk about the Asian values, they're really Southeast Asian values, relevant or discussed or in the discourse contained in the land east of Thailand. They always claim towards the rising sun, that is toward Japan. Next. Next. Well, I skipped this. I've already spoken about it. Next. If we look at Japan itself, if you say the Japanese value, no, previous slide, please. Japan itself, say it has several values. See, Shinto and related beliefs, there are 66.8% people. Buddhism and related beliefs, there are 79.2% people. It don't add up to 100%. Why? Because there's a considerable overlap between Shinto and related beliefs, Buddhism and related beliefs. Therefore, the values also of different people within the Japanese realm are overlapping. They're not, even if you take a very specific case of a country, there are just in India, is the regional variation. In Japan, is there variation within the same place depending on your faith. Next. So again, getting back to this, just to remind that we are different in a fundamental sense. If we're different in a fundamental sense, it's very difficult to have the same values. Each of these countries, if you see their customs, usage, institutions are very different. They have a different history of struggle. They have a different history of fights. They have a different history of evolution of their society. There is a different history of wisdom. If you look at China and to the Southeast Asia, it's mostly Confucianism. In India, it is Hinduism, Buddhism. They have all values which have permeated through society and have a very strong influence even now. Next. Next. Okay. Now, whose values are we talking about? Is it nation values? Is it the leaders' values? Or is it the people's values? If we are talking of the nation's value, I mentioned this briefly in the beginning, it has to be codified. It has to be written somewhere. It must be approved by a system and by an authority and an institution empowered to do so. Let me go to the next slide. I will illustrate this by the constitutions of different countries. Next. If you see the Indian Constitution, by the way, India is, if I'm talking, previous one, please. If I'm talking of India, India is about 16-17% of the whole world. So it is very significant. See, if you look at the Constitution, it said justice, liberty, equality, and fraternity. These are the values. These are the rights of individuals. I have a right to liberty. Individual is not community rights. I have a right to equality before law. Equality before law is of the individual, not of the community. I have a right to justice. I have a right to liberty. I have a right to fraternity. These are all individual rights. To say that, therefore, the Asian values are community-based and the Western have individual-based will be approximation of truth, not really the reality. Next.
Dr. Mukherjee, you have 1 or 2 minutes left to wrap up so that people can
have
ask you more questions.
1 minute. If we look at the fundamental rights of Bangladesh constitution, they're approximately same it is. Their individual rights are very strongly advocated. Next. Next. If we look at the constitution of Sri Lanka, dignity of the individual shall be upheld. It is the individual right, not community. Next. Next. You see the constitution of Pakistan. It is Islamic values. It is not Pan-Asian values. It is Islamic, very specific, as in the Sunnah or Hadith or the Quran. So it's their values, again, individual based. Next. Next. Then all countries are signatories to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There also the recognition is of individual rights. There are community rights, but the rights in the 192 countries are signatories to it and ratified. Ambassador will know. There are all individual rights. There are universal rights. Next. So values are universal. Differences in emphasis are there. There can be people's values, there can be leaders' values, there can be national values, but I have difficulty in saying there are Asian values. Next. Please disagree with me. Thank you so much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mukherjee. That was, that was a comprehensive review of, values from different perspectives from, across Asia. I just wanted to ask you, you mentioned that, many countries do emphasize on individual rights. So, it's not universal that the Asians hold communitarian values alone. You also mentioned that, nations have a right to self-determination and principle of non-intervention to look into human rights abuses, is not really appreciated when the nations have this right to self-determination. But this has not really helped the world. And sorry, do you want to clarify?
I didn't say that. That was spoken by the Chinese delegation at the 1993 Convention on Human Rights.
Would you agree with that?
No, I don't.
Okay, because I remember you mentioning that it's problematic. So that I was leaning, it's problematic. Could you elaborate on it? Because there is a tendency for many nations to hide behind the self-determination argument and really indulge in human rights abuses, including in India, So
well,
how would you address it?
Well, first of all, I will expunge the remark on the human rights abuses in India. I don't want to get it right. There is a separate debate altogether. There are human rights abuses in every country in the world. So let us not castigate India on that issue. I don't say our human rights record is absolutely brilliant, but there are human rights abuses everywhere. Now, right to self-determination can lead to balkanization. Whose determination are we talking about? Who decides the right to self-determination? So, the right to self-determination should be within the contours of the constitution as by law established. If you do not change the constitution of a country, to give the right to self-determination will be absolutely disastrous, because then will be balkanization. Some portions of Tibet will want to get out of China. In China, the Muslim part of the Chinese territory, I can't pronounce the name of the province, they will want self-determination, they want to go out. So self-determination, whose self-determination, who decides self-determination, what is the process? There are many questions there, right? Self-determination is not fluid. It's not a very easy concept. It's not easy to operationalize. So, for instance, Singapore and Malaysia were together, right? And despite the great leadership in Singapore, it went out from Malaysians that whether you say federation or coalition or whatever. So self-determination is a problematic issue. I may appear to be conservative, but that is where I am. At 73, I don't have any intention of changing my experience of 60 years in the field. And by the way, when I'm talking of values, I have worked in all the countries in Asia at the ground level, in villages, in ponds, in sea beaches, in forests, in marshes. People value in these places, the people value, even in Afghanistan and North Korea, people values of the common man or the common woman, or common children are very different from the values espoused by the leadership, for whatever reason. That's the fact.
Thank you, Dr. Mukherjee. From the audience, there's a question that, do you feel that Asian values are often pitted and falsely pitted against Western values?
Exactly, that's what I say. Values there, all values are honored everywhere. Individuals are honored here, individuals are honored in West. Community is honored here, community. See, the most important community development initiative has come from Robert Chambers in Institute of Development Studies. He is the pioneer in community work. Community in Manchester, community work in Edinburgh, community work in Liverpool, they've all come. So community work in Iowa. So it's, these community is there. So the emphasis is different. Some cases it is more pronounced, some cases less pronounced.
It's beautiful. What a beautiful point of view. I know that Neha, this is very close to her heart. Neha, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I'm finding this discussion and this debate very interesting, and I mean the whole purpose of this roundtable. Countering what Shabrinath said, that, we are sort of romanticizing the Asian values. I think we wanted to bring in the whole debate on both sides. But what I find interesting is that we are sort of almost unequally divided even on this panel. So we have two panelists who sort of are a little more conservative about this approach on Asian values. And we have about 3 panelists who felt that, this is perhaps, something we should take on. And what was also interesting for me to see was that it was the younger panelists who were far more hopeful. But of course, we have to learn from your experience and, the falls and the challenges.
I'm very hopeful also.
Yes.
But what I say is, if you have given me a topic, I confine myself. But the essential point I'm saying is, all values are valued in different parts of the world. The emphasis is different.
And I think on that account, we agree with you, because I think this particular initiative is trying to steer away from Pan-Asianism, where we are not saying that we must come together as one. In fact, we're even sort of refuting, ADB's efforts of integrating the region, through trade and economics, because we feel that the region can't come together as one. So it's not about Pan-Asianism. What we are saying is that, can we develop an awareness about values? Now, surely, those values will be different at different populations in, demographic hierarchies, state, individuals, etc., regions of Asia. Those must be different. But can we legitimize it? Can we actualize it? I haven't seen this in my 10, 15-year career, even with the development world, even with the UN, Dr. Mukherjee, as we develop programs, as we go into the region, we aren't talking about this aspect on values. So I think it's with that hurt and that pain that we come in. And I could even hear Parag Khanna often say, I don't want to sound very controversial, but, these are some values, community, and, the fact that Asian countries are looking at, governance of their tech spaces and things like that. So we come already, even as a liberal or as sort of, outspoken as we are, we come with a certain consciousness about our value system. We aren't bold about it. We feel that it's something that we shouldn't. We're a little, I would say, I can't use the word shameful, but we are a little less confident about it. And I think that's what we want to change through this initiative.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Actually, we should not try to homogenize.
Yes.
Diversity is what will throw up ideas, throw up momentum, throw up growth. Those who say that you must wear these clothes which I decide, you must eat what I decide, you must practice the religion that which I decide, that's not going to lead us anywhere.
Yes.
Diversity is the key to progress.
Absolutely.
So, Dr. Mukherjee, that ties in with a question from the audience. Do you feel Asian values is kind of a tool of that the majority uses to exploit minority?
Well, this is the unending debate. You have to have another roundtable on this. From the beginning of since the 1993 conference on human rights, people who are against the Asian values have always used it that based on human values. The same quite I quoted the statement of the Chinese foreign minister that rights of the state will prevail over the rights of the individual, and economic rights and social rights will be above political rights. So there are some cases it has happened, some cases it may not, but it is not always the case. It's not always the case. Any instrument you have in the world is a double-edged weapon. It can be used either way. But values are values. All values are very, very valuable. Value is like a compass. Without values, a society, a people, or a nation is like an aircraft without a pilot. Values are important. All values are important. Only my problem is don't classify it because there's considerable overlap. A lot of Asians in West, they could carry on with their values that they carry from the country.
Thank you, Dr. Mukherjee. We do have one more presentation, which is very different from the policy, from the views of the policymakers and academics. But thank you, Dr. Mukherjee. I love the way how you are really exposing us to the gray areas than taking a binary view about Asian value system or in a value system in general. I love the way how you kind of gave this different shades of values from different different entities and different right holders than kind of making it universal. I'm sure we can explore more here. Yeah, sorry, Dr. Mukherjee. Yes.
I'm one of her great fans, both her and her husband. So, namaskar, Geeta Chandran ji. Welcome to the panel.
So, Geeta Chandran, we are very happy to kind of have this visual piece shared by Geeta Chandran. She is the Indian classical dancer, and she's an artist. She's a recipient of the Padma Shree Award, the 4th highest civilian award given by the Government of India for her contribution to the field of art. In 2010, she received Dr. Sadhana International Empowerment of Women Award. In 2009, the World Congress of Women bestowed her with the Lifetime Achievement Award to acknowledge sustained commitment to gender issues through classical dance. In 2005, she held the Outstanding Artist status granted by the Indian Council for Cultural Relations. She will share the artist perspective about Asian values through a visual medium. She was unable to join us today, but we will be presenting the visual medium that she shared to express her thoughts on Asian values. She calls it Dance as a Way of Life.
Namaskar, and thank you for inviting me to address this ideation seminar on Asianism Retold. Quite frankly, when Neha invited me to speak at this forum, I hesitated big time because Asia is such a complex mystery. How was I at all qualified to attempt this? But then I realized that as a practicing Indian classical dancer, my story is also an equal part of the Asian story. Which brings me to the first problem of Asianism Retold is that we do not tell our one Asia story often enough to our children, students, and youth. And this needs to be corrected. And this conference of ideas, so lovingly curated, probably is the first big step towards rethinking our common Asian roots through the window of Asian values. My knowledge is, of course, based on my classical dance, Bharatanatyam, that has a unique pedagogy that has been bequeathed to us through a traditional system of learning where students learn both the craft and the art of the classical dance through an intimate interaction with their teacher or guru. They imbibe not just the movements and expressions of the dance, but also the lifestyle and values of the guru, the teacher, who is their mentor and guides them to find themselves in the dance. The word guru means just that, someone who removes the gu darkness and leads the disciples to ru representing light. The first gesture taught in Indian classical dance, whatever the style, is the Bhumi Pranam, the salutation to Mother Earth, a humble gesture where the dancer pays obeisance to the earth. With that gestural touch, the dancer seeks permission from the earth to dance on her. This unique connection of the dance to planet Earth bequeaths to the dance a deep connection with human existence and sustainability. It makes us humble and links the individual to the vaster whole, the physical and metaphysical universes. The dances of Asia are all earthbound. Unlike the dances of the West that seek to be aesthetically crafted against the force of gravity, the Asian dances are all firmly grounded and are built integrating the force of gravity. In my own dance style of Bharatanatyam, our unique Aramandi or half-sitting posture pivots the human body to the pull of Earth's gravity, and we manipulate our movements reverentially, understanding gravity. Each time we strike our heel or foot on the ground, we are applauding the gravitational life force. The other Asian value that the arts yield is that we are seekers, not of mere vidya, learning, but of gyan, comprehensive knowledge. Our search is determined not by short-term goals, but longer goals of enlightenment, where the inner spiritual search has to be equally satisfied, even while we chase short-term goals. It is this twin reed of dual realities that infuses the Asian search, the practical coexisting with the inner search or dream, the cyclical always informing our linear ambitions. This double reed is crafted into my classical dance, the linear rhythms that we learn to master then yield to us a unique freedom where we can improvise and express our deepest selves in the way we want. That is why choreography or choreographers do not easily enter the arts lexicon of Asia. We prefer visualizers, since what every dancer expresses is uniquely their own persona and something that cannot be committed to a predetermined routine. Improvisation what we call manodharma, is integral to the dance. The other value that links us is freedom and the ability to express our own personal convictions and dreams. The aim of the arts of Asia is not to be bound, but to permit the artist's inner flight to attain deeply personal goals. This emphasis on self-expression is also reflected in the pedagogy of the Asian arts, where the artists are taught to express oneself. Facial expressions and hand mudra or gestures become a sophisticated language that have to be mastered by both the artist and the audience. And this unique understanding of the arts by the viewer yields perfect joy to both the viewer and the viewed. And this unique connection with the audience is inbuilt, for example, into the first gestures that we are taught in Bharatanatyam. The first salutation, pranam, held high over our heads, pays obeisance to the larger spiritual powers that guide us. The second namaskar, held reverentially at the center point of the forehead, is to mark respect to our knowledge givers, our gurus and teachers. And the third salutation, held mid-chest, is to the audience, who become co-travelers in the artistic journey. This respect for the others, co-traveling with you, is reflected both in the spires of Asian architecture and in the humble doorways where one bends low to enter an abode, a symbol of entering in utmost humility and of leaving one's ego outside. In Japan's Ikebana, the three principles of heaven, earth, man completely mirror the deep philosophy of Bharatanatyam. Such values are cultural and can be equally found in other arts of Asia, where the values of Zen informs human attitudes. In Japan and China, for example, the cultural values that one aspires for are simplicity, subtle grace, freeness, tranquility, and beauty in the understated. The Asian artistic temperament is also full of symbolism and pregnant with multiple meanings. One of the most popular symbols of the dance from India is the motif of the dancing Shiva. Allow me to lead you in dance through the mysteries of the iconography, which will enable you to see in concrete terms what I have said on Asian values.
That was definitely a visual treat. Often when we talk about panel discussions, we often tend to take a very linear approach about, just discussions. So we thought, and sometimes diversity of voices are not brought to the table, which is why we thought, artists and their perceptions and the visual medium is an important way to kind of take our discussion in a different level. So I think we are almost kind of, coming to an end to this session. So I would like to open it up for Q&A. And we did get some questions from the audience. So I would like to go back to Professor Rebecca. Professor Rebecca, I hope you're still there.
Yes, I'm here. Awesome.
Thank you so much. I know it was. Professor Rebecca, in your slide, you had mentioned that why do Western perceptions about Asian values always revolve around Guanxi corruption or crony capitalism and so on? Could you answer it to us?
Yes.
And also, how do you establish a value-inclusive leadership?
Yep. Okay. Let me think about that. Actually, I understand in the chat or private question to me, and they're very good. A
Oh,
lot
you're
of
welcome to answer that if you prefer to answer the private question to you.
yeah. And then okay, let me kind of share my personal idea. I presume Asia, so why Asian values are not so much recognized by now or misinterpreted kind of things. So this is our task to find the answer or to tackle this kind of issue in a much more proactive way. So I saw this as a theme of inclusivity. Actually, for me as a researcher, I can see by using only Asian value, we cannot approach to the global world, global village. So we have to use their idea. That's why my main research approach is comparative study between the West and East. I have one private question from audience. This is brilliant. So many Asian scholars, they are talking about that by using the theme of cross vergence or kind of a syncretism or hybrid, this kind of things. So by using the theories and ideas from the West, we cannot start from Asian value. To be honest, that's my opinion. By using their opinion, how we can differentiate our value, Asian value, in a much more rigorous way, scholarly way, or practical way. That's our task. Maybe we don't have enough time to share of our value, but this time the world or global village, they, seemingly, and they try to change their view. They would like to listen to Asian views or Asian values. This is kind of, as I've said, kind of a period of adolescence. So in this time, as Litcy said, this is really high time for us to share our values. And also, Dr. said whether this is universal, value is universal or situated. That's also we have to think about that in a serious way, especially Asian scholars. They have to make very rigorous conceptual framework for us to show our uniqueness of Asian value to the world. Without this one, just sharing our value about uniqueness, I think they will not listen to us. That's my suggestion. So let's try to converge. And then let's try to beyond whether Asia can lead the world or not. Let's try to, think how we Asia can contribute to the global society by using our unique value. That's why I suggest you as a way of inclusivity. That's our kind of competitiveness.
Yeah.
That's what I suggest.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Sorry, Dr. Professor Rebecca. I feel I'm interrupting you. Okay. But I mean, it's that's exactly even our it ties in so well with the program that we are conceptualizing too. We need a framework. You're absolutely right. We need that standards or framework to kind of bring those Asian values out in the global landscape. So I'm sure we'll be in touch more to kind of talk more about it. Now the next question is to Ambassador Belahari. Ambassador, you mentioned about a communitarian-centric governance. So at what point will this become counterproductive to the economic and political stability of a country? Will any Asian values prevent such a risk? I mean, for example, if you look at, Chilean dictator Pinochet, he really brought market economy and stability, but, there was a point when it got converted into dictatorship. Russia, Putin definitely brought the stability, economic stability, but, so maybe Asians haven't seen it in that scale, but, at what point do you feel it would become counterproductive?
Well, circumstances change situations. I don't think there is a simple, all-embracing answer. You have to look at particular cases. My starting point is that values must have utility. If they don't serve a purpose, or they may have served a purpose at a particular point of time, at a particular stage of a country's history, but as you move along and circumstances change, the context changes, maybe those values will be less emphasized and others come to the fore. So my basic approach is one that is eclectic. Let us look around the world for what values we can use to solve the problems that we face at any particular. They may be Indian values or Japanese values or Chinese values or Scandinavian values or American values. Let's not confine ourselves, right? If you look at the history of Asia since the late 17th century, it is one of adapting to contact with a completely different value system from the West, right? And we took some things and we didn't take some things. And some things we took in the early part of that process are no longer relevant today. And this is a continual process. I don't think you can ever find a single still point of perpetual equilibrium. It is always a dynamic process. So, I can't give you a simple answer, sorry, because there isn't one.
No, that's amazing. I mean, but when you talk about this utilitarian approach, shouldn't we also set some ideals, some higher standards that we can aspire to? Because pragmatism often may not help us aspire towards certain higher goals.
Well, yeah, you can always set higher goals, but we can always dream, but you must make your policies during your waking hours. I'm looking at this from the point of view who has spent his entire career as a civil servant, right? In the foreign ministry, but still a civil servant, right? So I look at it from a very practical, utilitarian point of view. Yeah, you should have, you have aspirations, but in order to achieve your aspirations, you have to take practical steps anyway. Aspirations do not come true just because you aspire.
That's yeah, you just nailed it. What can I say coming from the expert? One more question to you is like Ambassador Belahari mentioned that we do not have values, we are different. But is it not the same in other parts of the world as well, where Europeans are Russian, English, Spanish, or Germans? What values unites Europeans or others, and what divides Asians?
Well, I think, this is a very profound question. You'll take not just one book, but volumes to try to answer it. But I think although Europe, for example, is generally very secular today, right? It has its roots in Christendom. Even the idea of the worth of the individual, I think, ultimately can be traced to the Christian idea of individual salvation, the New Testament idea rather than the Old Testament idea, right? That is controversial. You can be debated, but this is how I see it. There is that greater stress generally on individual rights rather than community rights. You look at the pandemic, right? I do not like it. I don't think anybody in Asia likes wearing a mask. But if we have to, we must, because we must. The wearing of masks is not a political issue as it has become in the US and some parts of Europe. To wear a mask or not in some parts of the US is a political statement. In Asia, it is a practical measure. Who likes wearing a mask? It's hot, it's uncomfortable, particularly in a tropical country like Singapore. But if I must, I must. If I got to go out, if I have to wear a mask, I will. All right. So it's a pragmatic attitude, but it is grounded in some sense that I am not the most important thing at certain times of community crisis. There was, throughout this whole crisis in Singapore, there was one woman just one person who refused to wear a mask because she said, I am sovereign, and I think most Singaporeans laughed, and were quite happy when she was charged in court, and punished, right? So there's a bit more. I mean, it's not that we like wearing masks. It's not like we like submerging the individual to the community, but in certain times of crisis, I think we are more willing to do that, more disciplined in accepting that, maybe.
Yeah, your freedom ends where my nose begins. So
your freedom ends. My freedom ends just as I reach your nose.
Right.
But I think we tend to pull our punches at far further back than in the West.
Correct. I mean, in the US, we are facing this problem.
Yeah.
It's So freedom, at freedom of expression at its worst.
No, Isaiah Berlin once famously said in one of his essays, I forget which one, freedom for the pike is death to the minnows. And this is a thought that is probably very relevant in times of crisis and pandemic.
Absolutely. I'm just going to tie back to Professor Rebecca. I know we are really running out of time. So, if you can keep your answer brief, that'll be great. You mentioned that businesses cannot survive without having a strong ethical stance. And if they need to have higher standards. Would you say the same thing for other stakeholders as well, like, politicians or civil servants or, professionals in different industries? Do we need that? Do you feel we have that value-based inclusive leadership across different fields within Asia?
That's a very important point. Actually, I did answer to one of the audience on this issue. Actually, this kind of Asian value is not only for the issue creating shared value or UN Global Compact Sustainable Development issue. This is not the only issue for business. This is the issue, or this is the kind of task for the all jigsaws, all DNAs of global society. Because business itself, they cannot do anything. Actually, the politicians and then NGOs, of course, NGOs' voice or NGOs' value is quite different across the globe. I know in India, NGO, you have a very big voice. However, at the other countries, it's not. So this kind of ethical approach toward certain value or purpose should be collaborate together, all the members of the community. That's why in Asia, I said, when I've studied corporate social responsibility with Professor Jeremy Moon in Copenhagen Business School, actually, it's really difficult for the Western society to understand on that. Why community? Because community, by having this kind of community, we should collaborate together. That's what we have to let them speak or let them collaborate with us, not West and East or West versus Asia, that kind of thing beyond that. So that's why this is all kind of members' task to develop the global society. Thank you. Thank you for your question.
Thank you, Professor Rebecca. I think it was such an intellectually stimulating conversation that we had. So before we thank everybody, I'm going to give the last word to Neha. Neha, after all this conversation, do you still feel there were many stereotypes that you faced, or did it get answered? If you want to give your last note on this panel discussion as a concluding remark, that'll be awesome.
Thank you. I think from hearing everybody, yes, there's a diversity of views, but it seems to me that we're all moving towards an agreement that we must look at the business of how we live through a values lens. How we do it, of course, we've got to work that out. There are a couple of ideas that came out from this conference. But I would say that in order to take those ideas forward, we will be in touch with each of you, each of the panelists individually. And we also have another roundtable Pramod is going to be talking about that. We would like you to come back to those roundtables because we don't want it to be just a conversation and it being left there, but for you to sort of engage and for us to engage with you on this topic. But I think two aspects that I definitely pick out is that we've got to look at the utility of these values and develop a framework around that. And the second thing, which is what Dr. Mukherjee mentioned, which is that there has to be a coding. You have a law for a country which puts in certain values, but for society to put in their own values, we have to look at what is that coding going to be, what is that system that legitimizes it. So with that, I hand it over to Pramod. Thank you.
Thank you, Neha. Ambassador Belahari Kausikan, Professor Parag Khanna, Padma Shree Geeta Chandran, Dr. Amitav Mukherjee, Dr. Rebecca Chungee Kim, and other distinguished participants. It gives me immense pleasure to propose a vote of thanks to very eminent panelists of the first episode of Asianism Retold. Before I start, please let me briefly introduce NICE, Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement. Is an independent, apolitical, and non-partisan think tank which believes in freedom, democracy, and world free from conflict. We envision a world where sources of insecurity are identified and understood, conflicts are prevented or resolved, and peace is advocated. Since Nepal lies between China and India, two emerging powers of Asia, our major research focus here at NICE is on India and China. Let me briefly mention what interested us hosting this event, Asianism Retold. Actually, I'm a strategic and political risk analyst. I look at China's engagement in each of South Asian countries and India, China, Nepal triangle relations. I've been teaching at universities in Nepal like Tribhuvan University, Pokhara University, and Kathmandu University. In China, I have been associated with Fudan University in Shanghai, Tongji University in Shanghai, and China Foreign Affairs University in Beijing. I have been also working as Senior Fellow at Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies, New Delhi. My research focuses on foreign policy and security issues of the region. But when Neha, Bansal, and Litcy Kurisnkal came with an interesting concept paper, Understanding the Manifesto of Asian Leadership, which later on we slightly changed, I got really interested because it raises some of the very important questions which Neha shared earlier, like why is it necessary to look at Asia from a value perspective? How has Asian values progressed? And what are the implications of Asian values in geopolitics and development at the national, regional, and global level? During my interaction with scholars at India, China, or Nepal, we often get to hear that it is time to look at different domains such as democracy, human rights, gender, social hierarchy, international relations, and values from Asian perspective. With the rising Asia, I think there is a greater realization among the Asians that we need to explore those aspects. We had a very interesting discussion today. We could not have got better panelists than this to start the first discussion. We are really honored to have such a distinguished panelist today. On behalf of NICE and Cali, I would like to express my gratitude to Professor Parag Khanna, author of The Future is Asian, How to Run the World, Dr. Rebecca Chungee Kim, Professor of Ritsumeikan, Asia Pacific University, Japan, Padma Shree awardee and Indian classical dancer Geeta Chandran, and Dr. Amitav Mukherjee, former senior advisor, Government of India, and senior expert at UNESCAP, for their very interesting observation during the roundtable. I learned a lot and benefited immensely. I'm sure our participants also benefited from it. I'd like to thank all our participants for their participation and interesting questions. I must also thank Neha, Litcy, John, and other supporting team of Cali and NICE for their effort. I think without their continuous effort, the program would not have been possible. Thank you, everyone, and please do join us to our second episode of Asianism Retold. We'll share the details soon. Maybe if Neha want to add something about the second episode, we'll be glad to have from her. Please keep in touch and have a nice day.
Thank you. Our next roundtable will be in June and another one in October. So we look forward to having you there. Thank you so much.
And we really appreciate that you took your time. You stayed back this, although we kind of, run over time, you really, gave, I know your schedule is tight and still you stayed back. We truly, truly appreciate that. Ambassador Belahari, I know that you had to go like much earlier, but you adjusted your schedule for us. We truly, truly appreciate it. And Professor Rebecca, thank you so much for staying, for so
Yeah,
long.
it was really good learning. Thank you very much. This is awesome. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I hope we
Thank
can
you,
all
everyone.
engage further on this.
Bye.
Thank you, Professor Rebecca. Have an amazing day.